and service. And lastly, another aim to encourage private capital and the private sector to take the lead in developing this nascent industry. So today we'll be tackling the bill itself. We will go into the bill itself, and admittedly, this is a work in progress. And I would like to thank all of our resource persons who have submitted their position paper. Let me give special thanks to our international resource persons who have given very detailed position paper. Thank you very much for your man hours, for the effort that you have given this committee in giving your thoughts and comments on the bill on hand. Let me make special mention Mr. Mohammed Badisi of the U.S. Department of Commerce, who have throughout almost 2 years in the making of this bill. He has contributed a lot of his experience, knowledge in the development of the midstream and even the downstream natural gas industry. And let me also make special thanks to Professor Silke Goldberg of Herbert Smith and Freehills. Thank you very much, Professor, for also giving your very detailed position paper. I know that you have vast experience in the European Union natural gas industry, and your comments and thoughts on this bill and your assistance to the development of the midstream natural gas industry in the Philippines is highly appreciated. And with that, I understand, Professor Silke, that you are in the UK right now. And to be honest, one of the positive offshoots of this pandemic is we have learned to use virtual hearings. And because of the virtual hearings, we've managed to invite international experts from across the world. And Professor Silke right now is in the UK, and the time in the UK is 1:11 a.m. And I have, to be honest, Professor, I'm truly honored, and thank you very much for sharing your time. Despite the time over there in the UK, you have joined us today, and you have shared a lot of your thoughts through your position paper. So with the kind indulgence of the body, and also before we go into the bill, let me ask Senator Risa for any opening statements.
None, thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm ready to listen as well. Salamat po.
Thank you, Professor Senator Risa Ontiveros. Although you were a professor, I believe, at one point.
Not a full professor, just an occasional instructor. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Senator Risa. And the kind indulgence of the body, and because of the time difference in the UK and also in the States, Attorney Mohammed Badisi is in DC, and the time in DC, I believe, is 8 p.m. in the morning. So with the kind indulgence of everyone, we will proceed with our international resource persons because of the time difference. And with that, we call on Professor Silke Goldberg of the Herbert Smith Freehills to share her thoughts on the bill on hand. So Professor, you're recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, Senators. It's my pleasure and honor to be able to share some thoughts on the bill that you're currently debating and considering in further detail. I would like, with your kind permission, perhaps outline, say, a couple of points as to background, and then address a few points regarding the bill directly. So perhaps by way of background, I'm a partner in the global energy practice of Herbert Smith Freehills, LLP, and a professor at Queen Mary University. And in the capacity as a partner of HSF, I've been advising FirstGen in relation to design of gas markets and related international regulated models. I would like to thank you all, in particular the Senator, for inviting me and allowing me to be here as a resource speaker at this hearing. My comments are largely based on my experience in European and other international jurisdictions. And the bill here, it is very much intended to assist the Senate of the Philippines by drawing on this international perspective to enhance the bill for the success of the gas sector in the Philippines. Let me first start perhaps by, I would like to comment on a number of particular areas. First, in relation to governance, then in relation to third-party access issues, as addressed in the bill, and then thirdly, in relation to stimuli or incentives, and thereafter, very briefly, time permitting, in relation to transmission and transmission codes. In the first instance, it might be useful to say at the outset that my understanding of the bill is such that significant parts of the bill are effectively enabling legislation for various institutions such as the DOE, the ERC, the DNER, and other governmental bodies to develop a range of policies, to convene working groups, and to issue RTPA permits to owners and operators of LNG terminals. This is quite similar to what we've seen in other countries, and based on the experience in other countries, it's important to have clear guidelines as to competencies and accountability in place. For instance, in the European Union, in the creation of the European network codes, both the European Network of Transmission System Operators, the Agency for Cooperation of European Energy Regulators, which is effectively the European Energy Regulator, as well as the European Commission, had in part overlapping competencies, which in particular at the beginning of the process led to some inefficiencies, which were eventually solved through the putting in place of a very clear framework when the relevant regulations, the network codes that then emerged, were recast. Also still pertaining to the governance issues that arise from the bill. There is a section in relation to the licensing of LNG terminals, which goes to the mechanics, in particular of Section 16. That's regarding the simultaneous holding of regulated TPA and own use licenses. And these mechanics are, in my reading, not entirely clear. So, for instance, it is not clear whether the dual permit that is envisaged by that section refers to separate LNG terminals, or whether the idea is that capacity in any LNG terminal can be partially reserved for the use of the operator, with the remainder of the capacity being made available for public use or third-party use. The latter approach has been used in European regulatory practice, and if this approach were to be chosen, further elaboration and a bit more detail as to how the coexistence of the two types of capacity might coexist, and that it might be useful to outline that in a little bit more detail in the Act. I understand, and of course I'm not a Philippine qualified lawyer, but I understand from colleagues that the practice is to set this detail out in secondary legislation. And this is similar to what has happened in the European Union. And here, the guiding principles for such secondary legislation, for instance, in the European Union, that was very much around transparency, non-discrimination of users and types of license holders, that was enacted in the primary act, and then the details came in secondary legislation. Why am I saying all of these things in relation to governance? Because one of the experiences that comes from in the development of the gas sector in the European Union, but also elsewhere, is to have a clear regulatory framework for the industry in place from the outset is really important, because legal certainty will encourage and assist investment in the sector. I would like to make one further point in relation to the governance sector, or the oversight, let's call it the regulatory oversight points in the bill, and that pertains to Section 5N of the bill. At the moment, this, as currently drafted, pardon. The bill foresees that all natural gas industry participants will be required to provide to the DFE all contracts entered into, including natural gas sales purchase agreements. And in the case of natural gas transmission utilities, these are then to be provided to the ERC, according to the reading. This is a very broad provision and creates some burdensome obligations for parties to these agreements. And in international comparison, such a very broad disclosure, including the entire contract to be disclosed, is somewhat unusual because it raises questions of commercial confidentiality. In particular, international parties might be reluctant we've seen similar discussions in Europe where parties then were reluctant to disclose and reluctant to initially contract with parties who had such a disclosure obligation. If the intention behind this is that so as that the DFE be informed as to the market flow, the availability of gas in the local market, in particular for supply security of supply concerns, also for competition purposes, then the European remit regime might be a good direct comparator. The remit regime, which is effectively a market transparency and reporting regime, means that parties to certain types of gas and electricity contracts, to wholesale gas and electricity contracts, have to provide core data, but not the full agreements, to a central digital platform, which in turn is run by the European Regulatory Authority and which then contains additional provisions which prohibits or which prevents market abuse by participating market energy participants in the energy market. Before I would like now to say a few things around third-party access and the role of third-party access in in mature gas market, the way that I've experienced it in particular in European markets. Generally, TPA is of course an important facet of gas regulation or the gas regulation, and it's generally found in developed natural gas markets where often state-owned monopoly undertakings constructed, owned and operated extensive onshore gas infrastructure from the outset. In Europe, and this is in particular reflective of the history of the gas industry and the infrastructure it has developed over time. In those jurisdictions, TPA has traditionally played an important role in the liberalization process, and it has in particular enabled new players to enter and into the market and to further develop the natural gas market. As such, the TPA regimes can act as valuable tools in this process and promote and provide safeguards to ensure transparency and competition in the relevant market. Typically, jurisdictions which today enjoy successful TPA regimes had gas infrastructure in place at the time of the introduction of such regimes. The hallmarks of successful TPA regimes internationally typically include a stable regulatory regime as well as an independent regulator. It's worth noting that TPA regimes usually take time to be established, and even in a more mature market, this is often a gradual process in order to allow industry to adjust and to find the market design that is right for the relevant jurisdiction. There is not really a one-size-fits-all, but this is just to say that these regimes take time to develop. It has taken the European Union 3 sets of legislation packages in order to arrive at the current market design in the European Union. This TPA as a central factor is, of course, also reflected in the bill, in particular Section 18, which provides that an issuing an RTPA permit for an LNG terminal, there's a number of considerations required, amongst others, the capacity and utilization of the LNG terminal, current and future users, existing and future market conditions, etc. It is not clear how the views and the potential concerns of future users can be included in an assessment of the capacity and utilization, given that my understanding of the Philippine gas industry is it's very much a nascent industry, developing industry at this point in time, and it is quite complex, therefore, whether the utilization can cater for expected future utilization in this context. Issues that pertain to the capacity and utilization of the LNG terminal will be critical for any investor, because this will, of course, determine the core of any commercial plans for and returns on investment. Again, as I said at the beginning here, a clear and stable regulatory regime is of particular importance. And failure to clarify the rules clearly from the outset may indeed act as a non-tariff barrier for investment and ultimately hinder the successful development of the gas sector in the Philippines. Ultimately, the inclusion of current and future users in the consideration as to whether an RTPA permit should be issued is a complex question, because the decision or the investment as to how to develop an LNG terminal is first and foremost a commercial decision, and also with the relevant risk for the developer or investor. And the draft bill therefore provides also for the terminal owner to set the price for access. The inclusion of the capacity for current and future users has the potential to inhibit investors as the class of stakeholders that need to be included in the assessment of the capacity is not clearly defined. It might lead to a situation where the decision to issue an RTPA permit might be subject to future competitors' views, and without such competitors having to actually invest anything, but they will have the potential to stifle the investment and damage the development of the gas sector as a result. RTPA also plays a role in relation to the natural gas transmission system in the bill, and effectively the bill proposes to create a public natural gas transmission system on the basis of legislative franchise. Again, understand from Philippine qualified legal colleagues that would involve primary legislation in addition to the other permits, so in addition to the own use permit and the RTPA permit, and that would be required pursuant to sections 21 and 22 of the bill. If primary legislation were to be required, this might create hurdles for obtaining such concessions and also for future amendments of such concessions. It also imports, by its very nature, political risk into the process from the investor's perspective. I have also some concerns around the timing that is involved, as it might take a significant amount of time to develop the relevant legislation, which could have the potential to delay projects for a number of years. In the upstream sector in particular, I've often seen issues arising from an approach that uses primary legislation for concessions or franchise, such as, for instance, a very long and complex process, but also difficulties in amending a franchise when new circumstances arise. The perhaps very brief comment on the natural transmission fee. This is to consist, according to the bill, to consist of amounts used to defray the cost of planning, constructing, improving, expanding, maintaining, and abandoning the system, as well as the cost of operating and performing the functions of a natural gas transmission system operator. This does not include any reference to return on investment, which, however, is something that we would ordinarily expect to see in such a context, which is a reasonable commercial consideration for investors wishing to invest in any gas sector internationally. Which leads me to the next section of my comments, which pertain to incentives or stimuli. In the case of the European Union, in order to encourage more LNG terminals and indeed gas interconnectors, so gas pipelines connecting to European jurisdictions, various stimuli and incentives have been made available for new infrastructure projects in the energy sector. In the EU, the concept of legislative franchise for gas infrastructure is not used, and the incentives I'm describing in my comments here are not predicated on such a mechanism. For instance, in the European Union, for certain types of regulated European projects of common interests, so these are projects of particular interest and benefit to the whole European internal market, there is, for instance, the possibility of enhanced tariffs, which are intended to provide incentives for projects with a particular risk profile. Other incentives might include the authorization to use long-term primary capacity for anchor clients or shareholders. So this would be own use capacity in the language of the Philippine legislation. And these incentives are available on application in Europe. On the basis of the experience I've seen in Europe, it might be helpful, therefore, to consider, in order to encourage investment in the Philippine gas sector, that appropriate incentives might be made available, so that the risks that are associated with large infrastructure projects, and LNG terminals and gas infrastructure systems are, of course, very large infrastructure projects, so that the risk can be adequately addressed and to allow investors to develop the necessary infrastructure for the future on a stable and attractive regulatory basis. Just perhaps a very quick word on timing. It is my understanding that the bill provides for an inclusion of LNG terminals in an annual investment priorities plan, as well as the incentives provided under Executive Order 226 of 16th of July 1987. And there are various incentives arising from that to encourage the construction and operation of LNG terminals. My understanding is that, as currently drafted, the bill provides for a time limit for these incentives for 6 years. Based on the experience in Europe with quite comparable regimes, it has been shown that this is not a very long period of time in this context, even though it feels like that. Perhaps sort of when you stand at the beginning of a particular project. In particular, if this period of 6 years is to cover the development and construction phase of a relevant LNG terminal. For instance, the comparative timelines in Europe are, there are certain conditions for the availability for certain types of incentives, and here the timelines are that they have to commence construction within 2 years of the relevant incentive decisions having been made available, and 5 years for constructions. The problem with that is that projects that have had the benefit of such an incentive decision often have to request extensions, because it usually takes longer for very large projects such as LNG terminals and gas transmission projects. So just sort of a comment from the European perspective that the timescales are important in that context. Perhaps sort of from the timescale point in relation to the incentive regime, a quick point on transmission and transmission codes. I note that Section 6 of the bill provides for the establishment of a natural gas transmission code within 1 year from the entry into force of the Act, or the bill, the triennial review period. Again, against the backdrop of the European Union experience with the development of the reasonably narrow European Union network codes, they have often taken much more than 12 months for each of these codes. Now, in the European Union, you could say, okay, you have many different stakeholders who need to be consulted, but also in relation to, for instance, to the British Uniform Network Code, which is effectively the gas grid code for Great Britain, amendments to the Uniform Network Code can take several months alone. The bill, as I understand it, does not currently foresee a framework in which the relevant bodies could rely in drawing up a transmission code. In the European Union, the situation was originally envisaged in a similar fashion, but the legislators in the European Union then introduced parameters for the network codes to be considered and to be translated into the relevant network codes. So, for instance, in relation to transparency, non-discrimination, etc., and similar principles. So as such, the European network codes have each been preceded by detailed preparatory works on guidelines for the future code with consultations for the relevant stakeholders before work on the actual codes began. And the mechanism for these guidelines was set out in the relevant EU regulation. I think I have probably made all the points that I wanted to make in this context. Mr. Chairman, Senators, I am at your disposal for any further questions.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you very much for the very detailed presentation of your comments and of your position paper. I would like to ask Senator Hontiveros if she has any clarification, any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, I did make a note of, well, I took notes of Professor Silka's presentation, and it also made note of her comments about an independent regulator that I'd like to ask follow-up questions about. But maybe later, Mr. Chairman, I can wait until after our other international resource person shall have made his presentation. I can wait, Mr. Chairman. Salamat.
Thank you, Senator Hontiveros. And with the permission of Professor Silke, would like to also call on Attorney Mohamed Badisi, another expert in the realm of natural gas, and he's a member of the U.S. Department of Commerce, and who's been also doing a lot of workshops, a lot of seminars here in the Philippines, capacitating different government agencies in terms of the natural gas industry. So we call on Attorney Mohamed Badisi.
Thank you very much, Senator. I think before I provide a brief overview of our comments, I'd like to defer to Attorney Sue Logan, who directs our broad portfolio programs in Southeast Asia, to provide some opening remarks. Sue?
Hi, can everyone hear me?
Yes, we can hear you clear, loud and
Great.
clear.
Thank you so much. First of all, we wish to thank the Senate Committee on Energy and the Office of Senator Gatchalian for allowing CLDP to be an ongoing resource as you develop legislation to govern the midstream and eventually the downstream natural gas sectors in the Philippines. We've greatly enjoyed the years of collaboration. We've engaged in with the Senate Committee on Energy, the Gas Policy Development Project, and the Department of Energy. Mohammed, more so than myself, I joined CLDP in January and really look forward to continuing to work with you all. So CLDP's comments today are made with the support of the U.S. Embassy in Manila and the United States Department's Bureau of Energy Resources under its Program for Technical Advisory Services on Hydrocarbon Sector Governance, which is the Energy and Governance Capacity Initiative, and in support of the Asia Enhancing Development and Growth through Energy, or Asia Edge initiative of the United States government. I just wanted to provide some brief introductory remarks before passing the torch back over to Mr. Mohamed Badisi for some more more in-depth comments on some of the areas of the legislation that may need a little bit more discussion. But we will keep our comments brief, as we know that Professor Goldberg is quite late in her day. So first, we just wanted to really commend the Senate Committee on Energy and the drafters and legislative aides and attorneys who have been working on this bill since reviewing it in June of this past year. We noticed that paragraphs were reorganized, language was clarified, and you could really tell that the legislation was thoroughly scrubbed to make sure defined terms were clear and consistent throughout, that allocations of responsibility as between each regulatory agency were, there was a strong attempt to define those clearly and delineate those in a logical manner, and that prohibited acts were spelled out in a comprehensive manner. We think all of these are great additions to the legislation. Our handwritten comments that we provided in December do provide a small list of some additional clarifications and cleanup suggestions, if you find those to be helpful. I think Professor Goldberg did mention a few of those as well. And then on a substantive perspective, we really commend you and think that it's a great it's a good choice to sort of focus right now on the midstream sector and leaving the downstream sector for future legislation. I think there's different considerations between the two, and I think that it really, in order to drive investment in the Philippines in the upstream and midstream sectors, focusing on this now and then following up soon thereafter with the downstream legislation will really sort of help move things along in that regard. And of course, CLDP is excited and would love to help be a resource on that legislation when you take that up. On the open access and RTPA provisions that Professor Goldberg spent some time on, we did see from the June 2020 version significant progress as well, that it looks like there have been strong efforts since that time to sort of strengthen and clarify the own use and RTPA provisions, which are quite complicated, which are sort of the most consequential pieces of the legislation, of course. And we do, in our written comments, we do provide some additional suggestions to further improve those sections. I will turn it over to my colleague, Mohammed Badisi, to elaborate on that a little bit further and get into some of our other, some of the other comments that we had.
Thank you, Sue. And again, thank you to the Senator and to the full committee for allowing us to share some comments today. I would just echo what my colleague said, that we've had the pleasure and honestly really the honor of working with both the Senate, the Department of Energy, and other bodies within the Philippines government on the entire project to bring LNG, to reform the gas market, and to create a new investment space in the Philippines. And I want to note, as Sue said, that I think the progress has been considerable. Our comments today are offered in the spirit of a perspective that we're very close to what should be a workable framework law. I think Professor Goldberg said it well, and it's worth restating that the job as we see it, and our experience in the US, and I think the experience in Europe is the same, is that the framework legislation should be sufficiently detailed to set out the questions, but not necessarily the answers, which is to say that it should detail what elements of a natural gas market must be defined for the predictability for investors, for the security, say energy security, for stability of supply. But much of the details, much of the answers to those questions will come out in implementing legislation, will come out in the deliberations of everybody from the energy regulator to the Department of Energy to even the Philippines Competition Commission, for example. And that's where much of the specific guidance will come about. So I think as a government employee myself, I understand very well the burden of creating policy because it's never perfect. And the pursuit of perfection is a pursuit of failure, as we say. But I think we genuinely see that the progress that has been made with the bill is approaching that point where the Senate should be comfortable with passing the law with the expectation that there's still work to be done after that framework is in place. I'll make a few comments now. As my colleague said, we'll try and keep them brief on areas that could benefit from a bit more clarity from a framework legislation perspective, where the specific authority should be more closely defined. Let me start first with the shift from the previous edition of the law to this current version of removing regulation of downstream regulations. And I think this has been echoed by others already. We believe that is a productive change, that is an appropriate amendment to the bill, specifically because the philosophy of regulation for midstream is fundamentally different than the regulation of a downstream market. A downstream market typically is focused on regulating fixed monopolies, where the concern is about protecting consumers from monopoly behavior, but also creating sufficient investment incentives for somebody to make that large capital investment up front and recover their investment over time. Typically, midstream regulation is more focused on boundaries for a marketplace. The actors in the midstream, project developers, gas buyers, and everybody else in between, tend to be more sophisticated, tend to be entities that don't require as much constrained or sort of prescriptive regulation. But nevertheless, I think, as Professor Goldberg said, they do require predictability. They require sufficient guidance to know what are the rules of the marketplace, what are the expectations once a project is constructed, what the operational parameters will be, and what are their expectations for recovery. How can they actually charge the fees that are necessary to recover their investment and make a return at the end of the day? And I think in its current form, the removal of the downstream regulation is appropriate. And the philosophy that has been adopted, and Senator, I think you said this at the very output, the philosophy of structuring a marketplace where there's sufficient guidance and protection of both the public interest and the investor interest, but leaving enough space within the marketplace for some experimentation, for some opportunity for innovation by investors, is the right way to go forward. And as I'll mention in a few other areas, we think that that's a healthy regulatory balance that should be preserved in the law going forward. One last note on the competition between midstream regulation and downstream regulation. It is, as a pure legislative drafting exercise, sometimes helpful to reserve the space for downstream regulation, which is to say, and we've had this experience in the U.S., we had a problem in the U.S. whereby there was a distance between our downstream regulation, which was typically done at a state level, and our midstream regulation, which was typically done at the federal level since it crossed state borders. That caused a lot of headaches in the U.S. And the reason for that is that since the two systems weren't integrated from the outset, sometimes it wasn't clear where the two boundaries, where the two regulatory laws intersected and where they worked together or potentially even conflicted. Even though downstream regulation has been removed from the law, a definition that it will be later promulgated, and that downstream regulation must comply with the parameters of this midstream law or some other language that makes clear the sharing of authority that will have to happen at some point, could be helpful, just as a reservation of authority, perhaps a reservation for a DOE, ERC, or others to begin that investigation. And at some point, that downstream regulation would become its own law as well. So that's just one specific structural note, a strategic note. I think the two key issues that we wanted to discuss today are the concept of third-party access, and then finally the sort of the investor sentiment or the mix of issues around standards and investor expectations. Starting with third-party access, I think Professor Goldberg provided an excellent overview. There's significant literature on this. I'll turn to my colleague, Sue Logan, in a moment, because we've actually worked on this very same question of third-party access in a few other countries in the region already. So we feel very familiar with it. But I want to make a strategic observation up front. Third-party access in most markets is a efficiency question. It's a question of encouraging efficient use of installed infrastructure. Another way to say that is third-party access creates a pathway by which a terminal, which may not be operating at full capacity, that remaining capacity, that unused capacity, can be made available to the marketplace and maximum utility can be extracted from that installed infrastructure. That's typically the focus of third-party access. It's sort of a market efficiency, and it introduces some elements of competition and liquidity and liberalization. We do want to note, however, that there are additional concerns in the Philippines, and with respect, and we know that this has been a conversation at both the Senate level and the DOE level, that one of the challenges in the Philippines is an energy security question, which is to say that as Malampaya, the reservoir of Malampaya is depleted further, and that essential source of natural gas supply is no longer a predictable source of supply in the Philippines. As a matter of energy security, given that natural gas continues to supply, 20, 30, or more percent of the energy supply, the security of supply, the confidence in knowing that at any point in time gas will be available to continue, producing electricity is an energy security question in addition to a market question. And so as you continue to structure the third-party access rules, some reservation or some clear definition of authority by which the DOE, ERC, and others can put out two sets of rules. One set of third-party access rules that function as a market efficiency regime. And I think that's been the focus of Professor Goldberg's comments and the focus of much of our comments in our paper as well. And that's around the expectations for, when access is mandated, how the permits would be issued. As we noted in our paper, a regular review period by which to determine whether or not the access actually has been provided, on an open market basis, or there have been some sort of, let's say self-dealing or other forms of inappropriate activity going on in the marketplace. One question on the third-party access that the law does very well now is defining the market rules, and that can be clarified, but I think that's essential and it's in the law now. The additional question of energy security, which is to say, when can the regulator determine that a terminal may be inefficiently used and that represents a security concern to the marketplace? That represents a security of supply concern to the marketplace. That's an additional authority that's not clear in the law at the moment. And it's not an essential part of third-party access regimes in other countries because typically they have alternative sources of supply. In Europe, you have pipelines. In the US, we have both pipelines and LNG and native sources, et cetera. So that security issue is essential in the way that it can be addressed. And we've noted this in our paper, and I think others have said this as well, is through a healthy disclosure regime. I think Professor Goldberg mentioned the challenges around disclosure of contracts, but generally some disclosure of purchase and sale agreements is typical in a marketplace, some level of disclosure, might mean not the entire contract. The other question that's going to be essential for the regulators in the Philippines and should be clearly delineated in the law is the ability of regulators to require disclosure about fundamental data on the operations, the supply, the availability, and other activity in the natural gas marketplace. Another way to say that is the posture at the outset of this new natural gas market that is being structured through the law, it should be a learning posture for the government. And the best way to ensure that the regulator and others are able to build out a sophisticated understanding of natural gas supply and security issues and modeling, future demand, et cetera, is through sufficient disclosure of data, information, and other activity to build out that knowledge of the marketplace. And the reason that's important at a legislative level is that typically, and this has been our experience in the US, and I'll defer as others have, that I'm not a Philippines qualified lawyer, but the ability to mandate disclosures is typically an authority that has to be defined in law in the US. Otherwise, the assumption is that most data is private, that most transactional data is private. And so I think a balance can be struck, and I really do want to be sensitive to the comments made by Professor Goldberg, and I'm sure they're elsewhere in the comments that received by the Senate. A burdensome disclosure regime does become a disincentive to investment. It becomes a cost that can burden projects. But an informed disclosure regime actually becomes a benefit to all market actors because the early investors in the marketplace know that they are educating the government on how best to operate the market. And the government is able to capture the insight in the marketplace that makes it better able to efficiently and predictably manage the market over time. And so disclosure, if properly structured, can be beneficial to all parties. And I'll leave this point, on the question of disclosure. It's a conversation typically in most marketplaces. What we've done in the US and other countries we've seen as well, a conversation is had with industry, asking the simple question of, what are you comfortable disclosing? And more importantly, in what format? Is it quarterly? Is it under a standardized, data disclosure system? Financial data, for example, in the U.S. is heavily structured. We have mandated templates and other, disclosure mechanisms. But other forms of disclosure, mechanical, safety, other data, tends to be on a proprietary basis. I'll leave it at this. I don't want to go into too much detail, but that authority to mandate disclosure should be clear in the law. I would argue, however, that the form of disclosure, what should be disclosed and how, is probably best left to an implementing regulation that is developed in partnership with industry, in conversation with industry. And Sue, let me just pause here because I think, our experience in Vietnam and elsewhere might be helpful just about how we've seen other countries develop third-party access regimes over time, that they did require some time to mature. I don't know if you want to make any comments there.
Sure. I don't take up too much time, but I just wanted to say that we have, we've looked into the sort of third-party access experience in both Thailand and Malaysia, both of which countries have, we'll call it a working, it may not be by all accounts robust third-party access regime yet, but it is, there have been licenses issued and cargoes shipped and delivered, and so we've looked at both cases, and what we found is that, and these are just sort of broad stroke things to keep in mind with respect to third-party access, and I think they echo what Professor Goldberg also said about the European experience, is that this transition, well, it's normally a transition rather than an institution from the get-go in a new sort of industry. So there is that to bear in mind, and Professor Goldberg said this as well. It's typically sort of a robust sort of working monopolistic market in which these third-party access is introduced. In Thailand and Malaysia, that was also the case. But I think in terms of, seeing what they've done over the last, say, 20 years with it, you see that like in the EU, where I think it took 3 rounds to sort of get there, in each case in Thailand and Malaysia, they've taken sort of steps towards liberalization, steps towards third-party access that have been sometimes successful, sometimes unsuccessful. And so I think it's just important to keep in mind, we can, if and to the extent those examples of sort of what exactly they tried and how that worked and what didn't work, if that's of interest to the Senate Committee on Energy or anyone on this call, we can sort of make that available and even dig more into details as well, just to sort of get more exemplars to sort of look at to what to do and what not to do.
And thank you, Sue. I think, and we've shared some of those other examples in the paper, and we're happy to provide more detail going forward. I'll just close with 2 more comments, general comments that I hope were helpful, and always happy to take questions. The third comment that we'd like to share is the notion of competition and really how that philosophy of competition should be defined under the law. We noted in our paper a few areas where, for example, whether it's terminal fees, or I think the idea of transmission tariffs, other forms of costs, other forms of charges in the marketplace, and how those may trigger competition concerns. We want to make just one very simple point. Competition generally is an outcome rather than a requirement in a marketplace. What we mean by that is that, generally speaking, the market matures over time. The dynamics of our market change. In the US, we have seasonal changes, we have daily changes in our market dynamics. But competition is something we define under our regulations as a sufficient amount of oversight, activity, and clarity in the marketplace that all actors, buyers, sellers, and regulators are comfortable in agreeing that the marketplace is open, it's competitive, and that there's real price discovery at the end of the day. And what that means, from a competition philosophy, is that at a legislative level, especially at a framework legislative level, like the law that's before us today, it's important that the law mandate oversight, and that whatever the oversight authority is, have competition as an outcome in mind, that they're seeking competition in the marketplace. But it's also important to avoid rigidity in trying to define how competition would take place. For example, when it comes to something as simple as pricing, terminal fees or transportation fees, regasification, to say that a terminal operator may not offer preferential rates to an affiliated entity, on its face seems like a clear effort to increase competition and reduce monopolistic behavior. And that in most cases it is, but that's most cases. At an early stage in the marketplace, a significant amount of the supply and the sales of gas may be amongst affiliated entities, because early on in project development, the project developer has to be confident that there's sufficient buyers, off-takers. So there may be a consortium of buyers, it may be only affiliated entities. Even with a regulated third-party access terminal, it may be primarily consortium partners who are buying the gas, and that shouldn't be a prohibited activity. And a discounting of that gas may not be prohibited early on in the marketplace, because that discount creates the incentive to sign the contract that justifies the construction of the terminal in the first place. All this is to say is very simply that defining competition as a necessary output, that it's a requirement for a healthy marketplace, empowering regulators and others to monitor and support competition, those are essential activities in the law. We would suggest reducing certain prohibitions, for example, mandatory auctions for RTPAs. Again, that should be a default perhaps, but a regulator can determine that perhaps early on in the market development, that's not necessary yet. Some flexibility in how to produce competition is helpful, because competition is harder to achieve at an early stage in the market because there are fewer actors, but it can be produced more effectively over time as the market matures and the competition authority and the competition philosophy matures with the market. And then finally, one other area where we would encourage a bit more flexibility, and this is another government to government sharing of experiences here. We in the US struggled for years with the setting of standards, technical, operating, safety, and other standards, even accounting standards in the energy marketplace. And this is for a number of reasons. The US is a funny place. We're one country, but we have 50 states, and each one of our 50 states has 50 sets of rules when it comes to, technical standards. And sometimes even within a state, in Texas, you can drive 10 miles and there's a different, oil well standard, and then another 10 miles is another standard. All this is to say is that we have struggled in the US to keep up with the industry when it comes to standard setting. We are constantly catching up to the sophistication and the innovation that's happening, from everything from new materials to new standard operating procedures to new design standards in the industry. And we learned a lesson, I think, sort of in the 80s and 90s, and it's really been enshrined in the last 20 years in the US, that it's better to view standard setting as a government adoption rather than a government creation activity. What that means is, rather than mandating as it currently exists in the law, that a particular agency shall create standards for X, fire safety, gas quality, whatever it may be. We instead have empowered our agencies in the US to adopt standards that may have been created by others. For example, primarily in the technical space, but also in the accounting space as well, we use what are called standards developing organizations, SDOs. These are industry bodies whereby the committees are set up. They have representatives of industry, the academia, and the US government. We sit on these committees ourselves, and they develop standards. A very famous one, for example, fire safety standards for LNG terminals. The industry develops a standard. It's based upon actual practice in the industry. And then the US government reviews the standard and adopts it as law through what we call incorporation by reference. We actually reference the standard in our regulations. The US government now applies standard XYZ, developed by a standards developing organization. To be very honest with you, it's a lot easier and it's a lot cheaper at the end of the day, and it's a lot faster too. It reduces the necessity that the US government be an expert in a particular area of operations, accounting, or oversight. And instead, it allows us to become an observer of industry practice and adopting that practice. But again, we sit on those committees. We have a hand in the creation of the standard, but it doesn't have to happen in-house. And that has been productive in a couple different ways. One is, and this was not clear at the outset, but it's become clear over time, by adopting industry standards, it's easier to hold industry accountable. Because when you hold industry accountable to the standards that they created, it's less likely that they can complain that the standards were ambiguous, unclear, or unworkable. And so even in litigation and in other situations, we found that using industry standards has a lot of benefits in terms of avoiding non-compliance in the industry. That's one. And second of all, it encourages innovation. The government is never behind, it's always alongside industry. And as industry develops, and I would encourage you to consider the fact that the Philippines may become one of the best laboratories for liquefied natural gas utilization in the world, because already you're expecting to use gas imports or gas in general as an energy supply. But the fact that it's an island nation and the distributed nature of gas, whether maybe we even have in the U.S. now where we're shipping gas by container. It could be LNG as a marine fuel, which is a major possibility. And the Philippines LNG fuels, LNG transportation, etc. I think the amount of innovation that's likely to take place in the Philippines is significant. And the best philosophy by which the government can support and facilitate that innovation is that partnership, approach to standards, as opposed to that creation of standards approach that was typical in the U.S. and I think is typical in many countries still in the U.S., but many other countries in the world. But we've sort of moved beyond it through experience here. I'll pause there and make one last point, which is to simply say that the general approach under the law of establishing market space, but allowing private actors to both take the risk of development, which is a significant risk, but then also be the operational and other actors, is important and should be preserved. I mean this as a compliment, and I mean this as something that should be really defended during the further legislative process. There is sometimes a concern and a typical orientation when you're drafting legislation for more government oversight. And we've had this experience in the US, and I think we've seen this in other markets. And I truly mean this as a compliment. The legislation as drafted now has a very healthy balance of oversight and self-regulation by industry. And that's something we struggled for years with in the US, and we had to arrive to at this point. And I think that the Philippines has the benefit of starting, learning from the mistakes of other markets ahead of time. That balance should be preserved going forward. And I think if it is sufficiently preserved and you're able to maintain this regulatory philosophy, you will have established one of the most predictable, but also one of the most open gas markets in Southeast Asia. And frankly, I would even say, in emerging markets around the world. And I think it's a commendable, choice. I really want to, as somebody who's been working on this for years and has had the pleasure of seeing the evolution, the commitment to fostering investment is clear in the law, should be maintained, and will really be a very productive and attractive feature of the market going forward. Let me pause there. Sue, any final comments before we hand back the floor?
No, I think you captured everything well.
Well, again, thank you, Senator, for the time. We remain committed to this process as being a resource going forward, and we thank you for the time today.
Thank you, Attorney Medici and Attorney Logan. Thank you very much for your comments. I have a few questions, but I'll ask Senator Hontiveros for her questions first, and then we can proceed asking the two international experts.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I actually just have about a couple of clarificatory questions each to Professor Silke and Attorney Badisi. And I hope Attorney Sue might also have some comments on my seeking of clarifications. Maybe I'll just present them all together, Mr. Chair, and then ask our three resource persons if they'd care to comment on any of them. As I mentioned earlier, Mr. Chair, and I do hope to ask these of our Philippine resource persons as well later in the hearing. As I mentioned earlier, I first took note of Professor Silke's seemingly cautionary words about confidentiality. And listening later to Attorney Badisi's comments about disclosure, just as an outsider and as a first impression, it seemed that maybe the European perspective that I heard, as I understood it from Professor Silke, leaned more on the side of confidentiality, whereas maybe the American experience, as I seem to understand from Attorney Badisi, leaned more on the side of disclosure. I don't know if this is a correct impression, but it's important for me to ask, Mr. Chair, because we always want to learn from the best practices and models in other countries as well. And I'm interested in this issue because I want, looking at our bill now, I want to learn if confidentiality provisions might not become unnecessarily broad. After all, the power sector is of vital interest to the public, and aren't power contracts and other related materials public documents as well? So I'm interested to have specificity about what proprietary and confidential data might be withheld from the public. My second um, clarification would be on, well, I found it interesting, Attorney Badisi's comments about upstream regulation having more to do with consumer protection, and midstream regulation, such as we're considering now in the bill, having to do more with boundaries for the marketplace. Because it seems like the two interests would actually flow into each other. Wouldn't, for example, midstream regulation providing boundaries as it will for the marketplace also, in fact, or should it not in fact also provide for consumer protection, in a symbiotic way? And then I was very interested in Professor Silke's inputs about an independent regulator, particularly because I want to ask Mr. Chairman questions about the possibility of our bill inserting a provision requiring an independent NGTSO, an independent natural gas transmission system operator. So I'd appreciate any comments about that as well from Professor Silke, as well as from our two other resource persons if they'd care to make such comments. Salamat, Mr. Chair, and thank you to our resource persons.
Thank you, Senator Risa. And we'll let Professor Silke to go first and answer your queries, and then after that, we'll allow Attorney Badisi and Attorney Logan to comment also.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you very much, Senator Hontiveros, for your questions. Let me try and answer the question pertaining to confidentiality and disclosure first. I actually think the European system, which is under a regulation for the integrity of, it's called wholesale energy market integrity and transparency, or also shortly referred to as REMIT, it's effectively a compromise. Under that regime, parties need to disclose the volume, the price, the parties to the actual contract. Certain sometimes gas contracts can be shaped in a particular type, not so much for electricity contracts, but basically any type of options or any relevant features that would pertain to supply security, but also that any competition authority might be interested in ex post facto. However, what is not disclosed is the whole contract. It's also disclosed on an anonymized basis, so it's effectively uploaded into a digital portal to ESA, the European regulator. And but obviously if you have the core data, that doesn't mean that you can reconstruct the contract, which might be quite sensitive. So if a particular company has certain views as to, they always draft their clauses as to, I don't know, liability or penalties or whatever it might be under various jurisdictive laws in a particular way, that is not disclosed. It is the core data, so that the regulator can be satisfied they have the information they need to ensure market integrity, but it doesn't go beyond that threshold. There were concerns in Europe about this, and because market participants did feel that this was going quite far, because I heard from somebody, I think it was Attorney Badisi just before, Attorney Logan just before, about at the point in which trading regulation or certain regulations had been introduced in the United States. Actually, in the European Union, up until 2011, there was no European Union level legislation as to trade at all. So there was it was only after considerations about market integrity and market regulation that this was introduced in the first instance. So it's quite late in the day, perhaps, and again, sort of against the backdrop of liberalization in Europe has started at some point in the 80s. So with over, well, at that point, 30 years of a liberalized market without trading regulation, parties were very reluctant. However, the regime as such has worked reasonably well. In addition, what the regime also does in Europe, it prohibits certain practices which were reasonably widespread, which are more relevant for developed intraday markets. So, for instance, high frequency trading to create fake transactions, and it's that sort of it's the sort of insider trading scenarios you might know from stockbroking or from the stock markets. Now, the European Union market has that effectively for energy markets, for both gas and electricity markets. So that the remit regulation has two parts to it. So first of all, it's the disclosure part within a certain framework, and then there is the market abuse prevention, which goes to transparency.
Thank you.
Then I think the next question was in relation to the independent regulator. My comment really grew again against the backdrop that in the European Union, and I have to say I cannot possibly comment on the Philippine situation because I'm simply not qualified in your jurisdiction, so I wouldn't know how. But in Europe, what happened was that very originally, when liberalization happened, there was no need for a regulator because very often the big energy entities were state-owned. So you had vertically integrated monopolies. So once the vertically integrated monopolies were unbundled, then you needed a market coordinator, market regulator. And initially that was often done within the ministry, and depending on who the minister of the day was, they might overrule that relevant department and take different decisions. And that's why in the process of the liberalization and integration of the European market, specific rules were created for an independent regulator. So that is different from the concept of the pipeline operator or the gas transmission line operator, which is, again, it's a separate concept. But that was the European backdrop, and that's it's perhaps more of a historical relevance.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Before we turn over the floor to Attorney Badisi and Attorney Su, Attorney Badisi is absolutely correct. Disclosure is really a sensitive matter here in the Philippines. Since we deregulated our downstream oil industry, there was actually the deregulation law was not clear on what aspects should be disclosed to the government. In fact, it became a source of litigation between the private oil companies and government. And government lost in terms of requiring the private companies to disclose and to unbundle their contracts. So it's good that these points were raised by Attorney Bedisi and of course Senator Hontiveros, because we want to make sure that there is a healthy balance in the law in terms of disclosures, in terms of unbundling, just to make sure that the consumers, at the end of the day, it's really for the consumers, just to make sure that we are giving the best prices to the consumers and competition is vibrant and healthy, especially in the midstream industry. So we turn over the floor to Attorney Su and Attorney Logan, and we can pursue that topic because striking that balance is very difficult. In fact, even when we were drafting this law, we know for a fact that our private proponents are quite worried about disclosing commerciality of their products, and I would like to also know how to strike that right balance. You know? And would like to also ask Attorney Bedisi and Attorney Logan, what components, in terms of unbundling, what components should we put in the law so that we will have enough information that competition is vibrant and rich in the industry.
All right, one second. I'm just taking a quick note. So thank you so much for the questions. On just a quick the disclosure point, I think from our perspective, the law, I think, being a little bit broader in the enabling legislation to say that the relevant regulatory agency can require disclosure of contracts, can require disclosure of data, I think is necessary, and I think it's good to have in there, understanding that the private sector participants will be a little bit nervous about what that means, and I think that's where the implementing regulations can really come to spell out what the requirements are, how the contracts will be disclosed. Oftentimes in the U.S., the full contract is required to be disclosed, but whether it's commercially sensitive information, proprietary information, commercially sensitive pricing information, however you sort of slice it and dice it and sort of give the private sector participants the chance to redact before they disclose, so that those pieces aren't subject to disclosure at all. I think the key there is to really sort of when the regulator start to go into the legislative or the regulatory effort to build the regulations, it's really understanding what do we want, what do we need to know in order to foster and grow this market efficiently and to promote competition and to sort of achieve the outcomes we seek to achieve with respect to this market. What information do we need in order to do that? What information is that, about these commercial transactions would not be relevant to us? Asking for irrelevant information is always going to sort of put you in a bad stead with the private sector. And so it's really getting down to what information do we need, and at the end of the day, either allowing for its redaction and in a full delivery of a contract, or as Professor Goldberg mentioned, having some sort of database style input system where that information and only that information can be input. So I think that's the sort of the difference here, and striking the balance is really to in the legislation, give the regulatory authorities the opportunity to request disclosure and to have disclosure, but then to really drill down within those regulatory agencies, what do we need and what don't we need, and what can we how can we regulate this market appropriately and help create the market and foster the market without without hindering commercial transactions. So I think that was on the first point. The second question Senator Hontiveros had mentioned was sort of trying to understand the extent to which midstream regulation, doesn't it also affect consumer protection in the same way that downstream regulations do? And from the way I see it is that the midstream regulations legislation, to my mind, is sort of it does relate to consumer protection. It is intended to help promote consumer protection, but because consumers, if you look at just the midstream sector, consumers aren't really an actor. The goal there then is to ensure you have a fair and competitive market. At the end of the day, it may take some time to build that, but you have a fair and competitive market, which will itself enable prices to be competitive for consumers in the interest of consumers. Whereas downstream regulation, where consumers are directly affected, it has much more of a sort of a traditional sort of consumer protection bent to it. And that, I think, is the difference that Attorney Batisi was trying to get at. But I will, because it was his point that he made, I will, of course, let him respond.
Attorney Batisi, before you respond, let me pursue a comment you made. No, you said that vague disclosure mandates can also lead to barriers to entry or something to that effect. No, you mentioned earlier, and I would like to ask you, from your experience, did you see anything of this kind in other jurisdiction wherein government mandated full disclosure of commerciality in the contracts, and that turned off basically investors from coming in? So I just want to pursue that angle and then go into the other topics of downstream.
Great question, Senator, and thank you for the clarification. Let me just say quickly on the general, regulatory philosophy behind disclosure. I think Professor Goldberg and Sue have said it well. I'll make 2 points in the U.S. that we've learned. These are difficult lessons that we've learned. Mandating disclosure is ineffective because broad disclosure mandates are a threat and they can be seen as a deterrent in industry. Authorizing disclosures, I think, is what Sue clarified, and that's really what we're trying to point out here. But it does create, and I want to be very clear, obligations on the part of the government as well. For example, in the U.S., because we have a rather broad disclosure regime, the U.S. government actually carries tremendous liability if we fail to maintain confidential information. And we are sued, and we often pay out damages for failure to maintain confidential information. So there is a relationship that you are building with these disclosure entities, and they may be public or private entities at the end of the day, and that creates an obligation on the part of the government to respect that disclosure. And so what often we find in the U.S. is that if you build sufficient trust, sufficient credibility with the industry, disclosure by industry to government is one activity, and then disclosure by the government to the public is a second. And they may not be the same sets of information, but they require a trust relationship to be developed. That's one point to be there. And one other point to make very clear, even whom is receiving the disclosures in the government is very important. In the US, we often don't disclose the information to the enforcement authority because they may then use that information in some sort of enforcement action, a litigation action. Enforcement tends to be to an information agency, a statistical agency, an oversight agency, an agency that is running pure analysis, is not doing enforcement. And they are prohibited by law from sharing that information with other parts of the US government. For example, we call that a warehousing or a siloing, or sort of, keeping the information within one part of the government. So I want to be very clear here that a disclosure regime, that could be broad, has to be respectful. The government's going to have to carry some obligations and maintain confidentiality, but also even within the government, the standards must be put in place. And the lesson we've learned here, and I'll tell you the reality in the US, is that because we have a rather broad authority to mandate disclosure, it's very rare that we have to require it. Most disclosure in the US is voluntary because industry knows that if they don't disclose, and then the disclosures aren't sufficient enough for the government to feel confident that they have the information they need, then the mandatory disclosures will come, and that's burdensome on industry. So at the end of the day, the threat is enough, and oftentimes voluntary action is enough. Now, Senator, I just want to make sure I come back to your question. In terms of if I understand correctly, was this around the actual balance? I think you're saying the balance, how far one can go, or what is burdensome? I want to clarify.
Well, yes. I would like to go deeper into that balance. No, maybe give some specifics, Attorney Betlisi, on that balance. Like, for example, for proponents, what should be disclosed? What type of information should be enough for government to make decisions when it comes to competition? So specifics on that healthy balance that you mentioned earlier.
Thank you, Senator. Thank you for clarifying. And this, my answer here actually relates to your earlier question about the approach to unbundling and how the government prepares itself to oversee a market which is shifting, which is changing through unbundling. The approach that we found most effective in the US, and I'm not going to say this is universal, but it's one experience that could be helpful, is that we focus disclosure less on the actors and more on the activity. What that means is we identified critical activity in the marketplace that the government is worried about. For example, a transfer of ownership, who owns a particular asset, a fire incident, when there's been some sort of fire incident on in a particular space, bankruptcy concerns, when an entity is not in bankruptcy, that's too late. When it is approaching bankruptcy, because that's when the government is most concerned, because they may have to actually step in. For example, if it's a critical piece of infrastructure, the government may actually want to take over that piece of infrastructure, buy out the bankrupt entity. My point there being, Senator, is that we focus, and this is in collaboration with industry, on defining critical activities in the marketplace that are of concern to the government, mandate, or at least create the authority to require disclosure around those activities. And then the actual form, the format, the depth of the disclosure, that shifts over time. But just to take a very simple one, beneficial ownership of an infrastructure asset is a big question. Who owns a particular asset? I think there's been many concerns in the US, and we've had litigation over this, that requiring disclosure of every single investor in a project goes too far, because some of those investors may prefer to stay confidential for a number of reasons. There may be multiple holding entities. That goes too far. The critical question may be who has majority control in an asset, who has sufficient ownership of an asset to be able to dictate the ownership, the operations, and critical decisions. That's a threshold of disclosure. So you may not want to require all investors, all equity holders, all money in the project to be disclosed, but a sufficient threshold above which, if you own enough of the project, it could be a majority, it could be above 20%, you can define that internally. That's a level of disclosure. Another example, fire safety or safety incidents, labor incidents, environmental damages. We have defined what we believe is a significant incident, but it's not every incident. For example, when an environmental spill goes beyond the boundaries of the project, when it goes outside the project space, that without question, even industry would agree, is sufficient enough of an incident that it has to be disclosed. But what level of activity, what level of incidents within the boundaries of the project? That's something that we've developed with our industry over time, and we've agreed upon a threshold above which every incident has to be disclosed, below which incidents don't have to be disclosed. And the flexibility there is important for two reasons. By focusing on activity, industry knows what the expectations are on disclosure, and that it's not going to be disclosed everything and then clawed back. Oh, we want to keep this part away. We want to keep this part away because these parts are commercially sensitive. It shouldn't be disclosed. Industry starts to build its operating procedures around disclosure, understanding which activities have to be disclosed, which essential information has to be disclosed. The other flexibility, the other reason why activity is more important than the actor is because in an unbundling environment, the actors are changing. In the US, for example, we went from unbundling 30 years ago to massive consolidation now, where we're having bigger companies come out, where it used to be smaller companies before. One company may own the transmission assets, may own the production, the upstream wells, they may own the actual power plants. We're seeing an unprecedented amount of concentration and consolidation in our industry. And by focusing on activity instead of actors, you have a future-proof law that tracks the critical activity in the marketplace, but instead of saying every terminal owner has to disclose X, what if the terminal owner changes? Or instead of saying every terminal owner has to disclose a sale of gas, well, what if the terminal owner sells all of their gas to a holding company, and then that holding company sells on to 1,000 different customers? You may disclose just that first sale, but those additional sales may not be captured in the law. So an activity-oriented approach is, I would say, the healthiest, the most acceptable to industry, and the most future-proof at the end of the day. And Senator, I want to make sure I've answered your question.
Yes, Tony, thank you. Thank you for that clarification. And then Senator Antiveros also has a question on the downstream activities. I think Attorney Sue initially answered that, and you can continue to elaborate on that portion.
Yeah, I'll just add, I think Sue covered it well, but let me just clarify two things. I think, Senator Antiveros, your point is very well taken. And if anything, it's another reason why downstream should be mentioned in the law, but perhaps not defined in the law, right? Because in anticipation that there is a related, in interoperability, and that there's a relationship between the two. Put very simply, what we've learned in the US is that by having a predictable and, more importantly, information-rich midstream market, where first of all, information is good for investors because they have greater insight into the dynamics of the market. It's good for the regulator because they have a greater ability to to identify and track activity in the marketplace. But also for something very simple, if you know how much it costs to produce, import, produce, and deliver gas at the wholesale level, then you have the starting price for the rest of the downstream activity. And if you're concerned about the cost for consumers and you want to have full transparency on that value chain, you need to have a healthy midstream regulation to be able to capture and identify those costs. So the additional costs of distribution and other retail activities can be separated. And it's very clear what a consumer is actually paying for at the end of the day. And that's a big concern in the US because, as I mentioned, we have sort of federal and state systems. The systems don't always talk to each other. And it's hard, and I agree with your point very specifically, there has to be a close relationship between the two. And more importantly, a functional relationship. It has to be understood that a lack of transparency and predictability in the midstream will make it harder to regulate the downstream, and vice versa as well. Because a badly regulated downstream market means you may start shifting costs. You may artificially suppress your costs on the midstream side where there's heavy oversight and inflate the costs on the distribution side, which you've seen in many countries before, and other countries in Southeast Asia and the Pacific. So I'll leave it at this, is that the mechanisms by which you build in disclosure, oversight, accountability, competition, all those words in the midstream regulation can be translated to the downstream space. Our point earlier is that the metric, the concerns are different because you're focused much more on individual consumers and how they're being traded at the end of a value chain, whereas in midstream there's multiple actors all transacting with each other, but the mechanisms are very much the same and the philosophy may be the same at the end of the day. So I think your point is very well taken.
Thank you so much, Attorney Badisi. It's also very interesting, Mr. Chair, listening to all our resource persons, even these images of the upstream, midstream, downstream, because it makes us think of the stream and how water moves, and water above affects the water at midstream and downstream. So very helpful comments. Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. I really appreciate the inputs from our resource persons so far. And lastly, I'd just like to especially share how much I appreciate at least a couple of the second to the last comments of Attorney Badisi, the point about trust. So interesting, so important, and very challenging, especially in the different democracy stages our societies are in, let alone and plus the development stages. How important the trust is, and how legislation like our bill can in fact help build that trust, even between and among institutions, to provide that measure of stability regardless of our political transitions when we're talking about an industry development project such as what is contemplated by this bill. And last but not the least, I found it so interesting what Mr. Chair, what Professor Badisi said about, Attorney Badisi said about sometimes a broader mandate gives birth to more voluntary disclosure. Very interesting. And so thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, to all our resource persons so far for the very helpful inputs. Salamat, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Senator Hontiveros. I have a question on TPA, which is a core concept on this law. And I would like to, and forgive me for shuffling between Professor Silke and Attorney Badisi and Attorney Logan. On the topic of TPA, I read the compilation of Professor Silke on the European energy markets. And from what I gathered and my understanding on that compilation, in Europe, TPA is a rule. No? All the terminals, all the pipelines are subjected to TPA. And there are exemptions. And the exemptions can be in a form of incentives or in the form of energy security and others. No? In the US, I understand it's different. No? And in the US, it's a licensing procedure. We tried to put those two concepts in the bill, but I just want to understand from our resource persons if which model is best suited for the Philippines, considering that we are a nascent industry, considering that we'll be um, importing gas in the next few years, uh, is a absolute rule on TPA a good model here in the Philippines versus, let's say, a licensing model from the onset? And I want to start with Professor Silke and then later on move to Attorney Logan and Attorney Medici.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me answer this by going back in history a little bit. So I mentioned earlier that a lot of the European level legislation came in over a period of 3 separate liberalization packages. When TPA was introduced in the European Union, it was introduced in a market that had already largely developed its gas sector, and which has also crucially already established the necessary energy infrastructure. So gas pipelines in particular, LNG sort of historically a little bit later than gas pipelines in all of this. But the energy infrastructure was established and the sector as such was established. It seems to be, therefore, if I extrapolate on the basis of the European experience, then saying, giving industry a chance to develop and to create the necessary infrastructure and on the basis of a clear and stable regulatory regime seems to be a helpful approach. I don't know whether that means that you need to license or to do it in a different way. So it is not so much the form that matters, I don't think, but what is important is that the form in which it happens leaves enough space for industry to create the necessary infrastructure. I've made a couple of comments in relation to the legislative franchise issues, and that seems to be a very complex process looking at it from the outside, and has a number of potential issues attached to it. I think my main concern is that you can only give really third-party, conceptually, I can only see a sort of third-party access working well, where the investors and the sector is secure in its development. If it's set out from the outset, I can't think of an historical model, at least within Europe, where that was as such from the outset. Don't know, Mr. Chairman, whether that answers your question.
Thank you, Professor Silke. Attorney Medici, Attorney Logan, any comments?
I'll start with a quick observation, then I'll invite Sue to. I'll let you know, Senator, that this was something we spent weeks discussing internally. And I think Professor Goldberg has an excellent point, and she's absolutely correct. There is not a lot of precedent in this space. I would love to tell you that we have, good lessons to draw from. The reality in Europe, I think I can't say better than Professor Goldberg. It stems from their experience. In the U.S., we actually outlawed third-party access. It was determined to be, an overburdensome restriction on commercial authority. Mind you, we have lots of other natural gas infrastructure, so it wasn't a real security concern. But in Japan, you see third-party access was a big concern for a while, but it's been, used very minimally. I think, Sue mentioned the fact that in Thailand and Malaysia, third-party access initially was a quite weak regime. It was underutilized. It was reformed over time, made stronger, more mandatory offerings of excess capacity to the marketplace. And now you're starting to see a greater utilization of third-party access. I think it gives you two lessons that are important for the purposes of drafting this law. I would not be burdened by the lessons of other markets. Because I think other markets, especially other gas markets, are hyper-local. They are unique to their characteristics. And I will point out again that the concern in the Philippines, leaving aside market dynamics and cost and consumers and all those efficiency questions, just pure energy security, keeping the lights on. The fact that you're talking about replacing one gas reservoir, which has been so fundamentally important to your energy security, with another source of gas raises so many concerns in the marketplace about making sure that that new gas source is predictable, that to not require third-party access, to let a terminal sit there underutilized, is a security concern. It's an energy security concern for the country. That's an argument that I would make. But I don't know what that means in terms of the law. And I want to be very honest with you, Senator, that I don't think any other country has faced the challenge that you have. And I think probably, if I were to offer an observation, is that you will have to develop a third-party access regime over time that addresses these market concerns, these security concerns, but is acceptable to industry. And I think it comes back to the philosophy we talked about with disclosure, that, mandating in the law that third-party access is required for every terminal, but allowing at an early stage in the market development that terminals may apply for a variance, an exception, that for the first 5, 10, however many years, I think that number could be discussed with industry, that third-party access requirements will be lifted or perhaps limited. 80% of capacity can be reserved, 70%. Those numbers aren't a concern at the law at this point, but they'll be a concern for implementing regulation. That's likely the healthiest approach to this question because we do not have a good answer. And so I think at a framework level, I think the Philippines is unique in the sense that third-party access is critically important for both market and security reasons. I think it has to be clearly stated and mandated in the law at the outset, as opposed to other markets which have put it in over time. But the mechanics of third-party access, the way it is managed and implemented, I think will have to be developed over time. But Sue, as I said, we've talked about this internally for weeks. I don't know if you have if you want to share the other parts of the debate that we've had.
I think that Attorney Badisi his approach is a good one. I would, with respect to having TPA as sort of the default versus own use being the likely default if given the sort of choice to choose one of the other paths. Another, if that's not for whatever reason, whether it's politically, whether it's what you hear from private industry, whether it's just whatever reason you have, if you maintain this sort of current system where open access own use permitting is sort of up to the investor, and that sounds very attractive to the investor market, and so there may be a strategic reason to have that in the law. And another way, and if that's what you choose to do for a number of reasons, what we didn't see in the law, and maybe it's because it was not quite clear, maybe it's because the duration of the permits isn't clearly set out in the law, but it seemed as though there are these two parallel tracks of you're either own use or TPA, and you can have maybe it's 50-50 of your capacity for a given terminal. But I didn't see a way to change that at any time, unless the permits are sort of on an annual basis or periodic basis, where one could say, okay, well, I've developed this terminal with my affiliated sort of downstream like power plant. We want to divest from this power plant from our portfolio. It wasn't clear to me what would happen in that scenario, whether you could switch your permit from own use to then, I guess it would, I don't know if it would be own use or TPA at that point, but it didn't seem that you could switch. Another thing that I didn't see sort of clearly set out in the law as even being having an ability to do maybe later on down the line is if there is a facility that's built for own use, and perhaps it was sort of a gamble on the part of a developer, the terminal, and its downstream use cases. Perhaps they were to be in phases, and those phases don't pan out. And they're sitting on capacity that could otherwise be used to transport, to import, whatever. You might say, well, it would be economically rational for them to open that capacity up. But there may be more strategic reasons why they wouldn't. And I think there's in the US, as in a similar context for power transmission lines, there's a concept where if there's a sort of a trunk transmission line and you're a developer, you build, let's say you build a power plant and you have to build a generation tie line. So you build a transmission line to connect, a connector line to the main grid. And you build that line over capacity because you anticipate that you're going to use that to build several plants, and you end up, for whatever reason you don't. The law specifies that there's a certain period of time that you have to use the capacity that you've sort of built for. And if you don't, at that point, you could be, if someone, that other developers, other users can request access for that. And in that case, you must give it. So that's just another way to kind of approach this on a sort of, I guess, incremental way. Because I think the name of the game for the Philippines, because of the way that you're, the stage of the market that you're operating under here, is that having flexibility, like, of course, investors need a clear regulatory regime. You can't just change the rules on them in the middle. But being able to change the rules for future, in future cases, or in certain cases, such as if there is excess capacity that you are not using within the sort of specified time frame, that can be opened up. So it's sort of, for each kind of scenario you run through, as to, what if we only use own use? What if we only have third-party access? I think the way to think about it is sort of thinking about the worst case scenario of every option, and sort of going with what you feel is the least worst case, if that makes sense.
Thank you, Attorney Badisi, Attorney Logan. Just to pursue that question, on TPA. Again, forgive me for shuffling between Professor Silke and the CLDP team. Professor Silke, from your observation, what would be a efficient process for TPA? Just give us a walkthrough, a simple walkthrough for a simple process of a TPA, from your observation in Europe and other jurisdictions. And can you also give us what would be a not only efficient, but what will be a successful process for a TPA or an execution of a TPA?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I can give you some examples of how TPA is organized in Europe. And again, I would like to underline the comments made by Attorney Logan and by Attorney Badisi. It is not necessarily transferable on a one-to-one basis. So, because the markets are at very different stages. In Europe, the TPA is by and large enshrined in law. It was successively introduced over 3 liberalization packages. It is by and large regulated TPA. It's also important to note that initially it was negotiated TPA, so NTPA for the vast majority of energy infrastructure, as an introductory sort of step towards our TPA. Senator, you mentioned earlier the various European incentives and exemption regimes. Where a facility has such an exemption or a relevant incentive, the regulatory practice is often that 80% of such a facility is reserved for own use or for anchor shareholders, and then 20% are put up for regulated access. This is true across pipelines, interconnectors, and terminals in a variety of ways, but broadly, that these are the sort of the hallmarks of the relations there. A TPA regime is successful if it's well understood by all market participants. It is successful if it is clear and transparent, and if it has mitigating features, because third-party access can also be used in an adverse way. for either the owner of the relevant infrastructure or other participants. So it could be used as an aggressive commercial tool against an owner of a terminal, so that somebody comes and demands TPA, then hoards the capacity and doesn't actually use it. So effectively sterilizes capacity for the market. And that is a concern from both the investors' perspective, because they can't access their capacity. And secondly, that must also be a concern from a wider industry perspective, because it links to supply security. If mechanisms to go against that, to mitigate those sort of scenarios have been introduced, they have typically relied on use it or lose it sort of mechanism. Use it or lose it mechanisms means that if somebody who has booked capacity, regulated capacity, this is not own use capacity, this is separate, and if that entity then doesn't proceed to use that capacity, they have to notify that on a digital board to the wider market within various prescriptive timelines. I have previously designed a TPA regime for an exempted European exempted LNG terminal in England, the Dragon terminal, which took into account the timelines it takes for an LNG tanker to arrive, or the turnaround points of LNG tankers under contractual notification periods, how much time is necessary for an LNG tanker to arrive from various points around the world, how much notification the LNG operator needs. So it's a fairly technical level of operation as well. And the key here is, for that to work successfully, is again actually a point that attorneys Logan and Badisi made earlier. It's about industry standards, working very closely with industry. Most of the, if not actually all, of the gas, the downstream and midstream section of the British gas sector work on the basis of industry agreements rather than law. So the Uniform Network Code is an industry agreement. The Balancing and Settlement Code for the electricity sector is an industry agreement. It's not a law. Third-party access is, whilst enshrined in law, the actual application of it has been developed in consultation with industry. The regulator of GEM in Britain has actually looked to industry for models of how can use it or lose it be developed, so much so that when Ofgem was asked to define use it or lose it, they said it's something we can't define, we know it works when we see it. And because they wanted to leave it open to develop workable models with industry. And sort of that is, so if I might summarize, a successful TPA regime is something that's accepted by industry, something that is understood by all market participants, clear, transparent, and worked on in consultation with industry.
Thank you, Professor. Attorney Logan, Attorney Badisi, any comments on the process for a successful TPA?
I thought that Professor Goldberg summed up sort of the parameters quite well. So I will not, in the interest of time, I won't add to that. I thought that was great. But Attorney Badisi, please go ahead.
I can't add much other than just to say one more point. This ties back to our discussion on disclosure. One of the questions around third-party access is that the government is really only concerned where the access is not being granted. Let me be very clear. To the extent that third-party access is permitted, that a terminal owner is open to the transaction, that a third party wants to license that capacity, there's very little activity for the government to do. There's very little oversight that's necessary. That's a straightforward, consensual, willing buyer, willing seller type of transaction. It's really where there's a possibility that access is being retained inappropriately in the marketplace that the government is concerned. And so to answer your question, Senator, what is a functional regime? A functional regime is one that permits as much voluntary activity as possible with as few barriers as possible. where those willing transactions are generally permitted. Maybe there's some disclosure to make sure that they're not sort of shadow transactions to tie up, capacity inappropriately. But that the government, through that disclosure regime, if it becomes aware of underutilized capacity and the inability of a third party to access it, that's where the really difficult questions are asked. And I think Sue mentioned one very important solution, which is when a third party requests access and believes that access has been inappropriately denied, on a non-commercial basis, an appeal can be made to the government. I think Professor Goldberg makes an excellent point. How that appeal is handled is important, because if it's an automatic, grant of access that can be used disruptively, so the ability of third parties to raise concerns is essential in the marketplace. That is absolutely essential. So the role of third parties is key, but also the policing authority of the government's ability, for example, to request, what is your expected utilization over the next 12, 18, 36 months? One example that we've seen in other markets is that by requiring, terminals or other important actors, again, the activity is the important thing, by requiring disclosure of supply agreements, not the entire agreement, but the key elements, the government can then extrapolate, well, if you signed up to import X amount of gas over the next, year, 5 years, 10, then we know this amount of capacity is being used. And you can reach the logical conclusion that, you should take the amount of committed gas purchase as an indication of utilization of capacity. You can maybe allow a reserve on top of that, 20% for some flexibility where a terminal may want to, or some buyer may want to buy on the spot market. But if those gas supply agreements only add up to 50% of the capacity, and you're still allowing that 20%, reserve, then clearly at that moment, the government has a credible reason, through a process that's open, transparent, and predictable, to mandate access to the remaining capacity amount. And maybe that's done on an annual basis, biannual. Maybe early on you allowed for 3 years, maybe you shorten the time period as the market matures. So to summarize, Senator, I think the way in which the government will police the marketplace, the way in which it will identify underutilization of capacity, is more important than the actual mechanism of licensing the third party itself, because hopefully at that point, if the access has been mandated, the parties will openly negotiate terms that are acceptable to them.
Then, Attorney DC, we go back to the issue of disclosure, because the only way government can effectively police the actors is if they have information and disclosure. And finding that right balance, as what Senator Hontiveros mentioned earlier, in the law is actually the most critical part. Because the only way government can effectively police the actors is they have information, if they have data that can lead to their conclusions of undercapacity or withholding capacity. So we go back to that original premise earlier as mentioned. With that, Senator Hontiveros, I've actually asked most of my questions. Senator Hontiveros, any more questions or resource persons?
Not to our international resource persons, Mr. Chairman, but to our Philippine resource persons, yes, a few more. Salamat.
Yeah, but lastly, before I let Professor Silke, Attorney Badisi, and Attorney Logan go, because I know it's already super late in the hour in your jurisdictions, in your host countries. Just a very basic question, Professor Silke. What concepts should be included in the midstream bill that we are talking about? I know we have already a draft bill right now, but what do you think would be very crucial concepts that should be placed in the bill so that we will achieve a vibrant, a successful midstream natural gas sector here in the Philippines? Of course, taking into consideration and taking into account consumer welfare, delivering the best price, and of course, competition. So just the concepts. We want to make sure that we have captured all the important concepts that you have experienced in your own jurisdiction. So again, we'll start with the Professor Silke and then the CLDP team.
Salamat, Mr. Chairman. I would perhaps come back to something I said at the very beginning. Looking at all of the various jurisdictions I've looked at and I've worked on, I've sort of in European jurisdictions, I've also advised on the privatization of the power industry in Nigeria and in Oman. So all very different jurisdictions. But the one common theme that kept on coming out was predictability of the regulatory regime and stability of the regulatory regime with, as Attorney Badisi mentioned it earlier, enough future-proofing in there. So again, an example from the European liberalization process. The European liberalization process was very fixated on institutions. It was very much an institutionalized liberalization, and they had to play catch up as the market changed quite a lot. So as new actors came on, new market participants came onto the market, technology might have changed. So the most important thing is the transparency and stability of the regulatory regime, which doesn't have too many which allows the investors to develop the infrastructure. So effectively, you're in a great position in the Philippines because you can think afresh on what would you like to have as your gas regulatory framework. In Europe, it happened the other way around. The gas infrastructure was there, and then legislators started to think about what should we do at a European level with all this infrastructure and how should we regulate it. Here, you're in a unique position because you get to encourage the building of that infrastructure and the building up of that sector through what you're doing in the legislative process at the moment. And therefore, stability of that regime is transparency is really very, very key.
Professor, what do you think we should still include conceptually in the bill, or have we captured the critical points conceptually in the bill? But do you have any more concepts that you think we should put into this proposed draft law?
Mr. Chairman, I actually believe that you have all the big categories or concepts that I would ordinarily, if I sort of open a gas bill or an energy sector bill, your bill has conceptually all the concepts that are typically found in such bills. So there is not an immediate lacuna that springs to mind, if I might put it that way.
Thank you, Professor. Attorney Badisi, Attorney Logan, any same questions?
Sure. I agree with Professor Goldberg on both accounts. With respect to kind of concepts in the law, and I think this goes in just what I'm thinking of it now, sort of contemporaneously. Third-party access does come to mind. I think one thing to bear in mind when, as I said, going through sort of the worst case scenario, if we structure third-party access in this way, or in this way, or in this way, one thing to bear in mind when you're thinking of structuring is, of course, private sector actors want to make sure that their rather large investments will be protected and that the rug won't be swept out from under them from a regulatory perspective. But I think I think it's important to bear in mind that this is sort of a developing market, a nascent market that will be developed over time, that will change over time. And I think it's important to just bear in mind and to think about, just to have it as sort of a little idea bubble in your head when looking at the law, is to avoid creating too much entrenched interest in one particular structure. And that's not, and as an example for that, if we mentioned that Attorney Badisi mentioned that perhaps a better way, or perhaps a good way to structure the TPA access regime is to have mandatory third-party access with the ability to request exceptions for the ability to get an investment going, or other reasons. Perhaps that's Perhaps that's a better way to do it, perhaps not for your market. But whatever you choose, especially if you choose sort of own use as a right from the beginning, I think it's important for investors to know that that own use may need to change or may not be a right forever, if that makes sense. So, you know, as long as they understand that, of course, investments will be protected, but if you have unused capacity, you cannot sit on that forever. That is not within the boundaries of what own use means to us. I think having that sort of just avoiding creating sort of entrenched interests that will be difficult to change the law later, or that will object to changes to the law or the regulations later, it will be sort of important.
Mr. Chairman, with your permission,
Yes, go ahead.
may I add one thought that is just listening to Attorney Logan and thinking about how the bill has been drafted in relation to sort of, Attorney Logan, you mentioned own use and sort of concepts around that, which has led me to think about incentives for we talked a lot about how the infrastructure will need to be created in the Philippines, and own use in Europe is one of the major incentives factors. And I'm not sure that the bill currently spells out the stimuli or the incentives around our own use, and perhaps also other types of incentives in order to create that infrastructure, which my understanding of the Philippine industry is such that the whole infrastructure would need to be created pretty much from the beginning. Typically what we've seen there in other jurisdictions is an emphasis in comparable bills on incentives, and some of which, Senator Gatchalian, Mr. Chairman, we have already discussed in relation to, by way of reference to the European incentives that are available. Apologies, but I thought it was worth mentioning.
Thank you, Professor. Attorney Medici, any comments on concepts in the bill?
Thank you, Senator. I think, as I mentioned earlier, having seen the progression of the bill, I think it is nearly complete. No significant, missing components. I would point out one thing that I think, as we said at the very outset, that the primary function of a midstream law is to draw boundaries. One boundary that could be perhaps a bit more clear is what is not a terminal. And for example, in the U.S., where I'm calling you from right now, I'm in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. A gas station, which is down the road from me, has an LNG filling station. It is a gas station with an LNG pump. Well, it's not a pump; it's a much more advanced thing. But you can buy LNG at a gas station down the road from my house. Is that an LNG terminal? Is it regulated as a midstream asset, or is it a downstream asset that is selling to retail consumers? Does it function differently? That's an easier question, perhaps, to define under the law. And I think the law is mostly clear, but not entirely clear on that point. Where it gets more complicated is if you have a regular terminal, as we have in Europe and some other places, where that terminal typically receives large ships and then injects the regasified gas into the transmission system. But now we have trucks coming and off-taking LNG in truck capacity. We have smaller ships, off-taking LNG and then sort of redistributing it. We're putting it into containers. You should imagine a future where a terminal has more than one form of offtake and more than one form of activity taking place, which means that terminal operator may be simultaneously selling wholesale gas into the wholesale pipeline system, but selling gas to an individual consumer. It could be a ship, it could be another type of buyer. I think that doesn't require significant changes to the law. Most importantly, you want to make sure that you're not disrupting or prohibiting that evolution under the law, that you allow for that evolution to take place. I think that is mostly there. Perhaps it could be made more clear that the law is not meant to prohibit or somehow disrupt those other activities. But beyond that, I genuinely agree, I think, with my other colleagues that it is very much complete or near complete in its current form.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Attorney Medici, Attorney Logan, Professor Silke. I know it's already 3 a.m. in the UK and 10 p.m. there in DC. But I really appreciate your participation and your openness in assisting us with this draft law. Like I said earlier, Our aim is to develop our midstream and hopefully our downstream natural gas industry in the future, within any view of protecting our consumers, giving the best price and the best service to our consumers, and also to promote healthy competition among our players. So with that, thank you very much for your time, and feel free to send us more comments as we go along this bill, and definitely we will reach out to you and ask for your opinion on certain aspects as we go along. So thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Salamat.
Thank you. Thank you. So with that, we will now go to our next resource person, which is the Department of Energy. And we're joined by Director Rino Abad to, tama ba? To Assistant Secretary Bodi Polido for their comments on the bill.
Good morning, Mr. Chair. Good morning, Senator Risa Hontiveros. Mr. Chair, would like to be given the opportunity to share a quick general comment regarding the really productive discussion that you had, you and Senator Hontiveros had with Professor Goldberg and Attorney Slogan and Badisi. And then afterwards, we'd like to make a manifestation regarding an administrative matter regarding the Department of Energy. And so listening to the discussion amongst you, I believe we can distill that discussion into essentially three major conceptual takeaways, and that's trust, evolution, and of course the unique context of the Philippines, the energy situation in the Philippines, and why this bill is so critical for the efforts of the Department of Energy in terms of energy security. And I'm going to say something that I think a lot of our stakeholders would make them cringe, and that after listening to those three conceptual takeaways, I believe the legislative and the industry and our stakeholders will have to trust the executive department. I believe that the enabling law, this draft bill, has to have provisions that are flexible enough that would allow the DOE and the ERC, I believe, the ability and the opportunity to evolve the implementing rules and the regulations as we slowly and progressively mature the LNG industry. There's going to be a lot of challenges in doing that, specifically because of the fact that it's so new and it's so nascent, and it's going to be going through several developmental stages, and each of these developmental stages are going to have its own specific challenges and issues. And we have to do all of those things in relation to how it impacts our power sector, how it impacts, of course, our own upstream energy resource development efforts. We do have an ongoing effort with the PCECP. We believe we still have a lot of indigenous resources in the West Philippine Sea and in the rest of the country. And then again, and it's part of the challenge, really, although we do agree with some of the comments made by our resource persons, one of the mandates of the Department of Energy is to ensure that the consumers are protected and that there would be fair competition and transparency. And so given all that, we were very supportive of the bill as it is. We do have some specific comments, and that's when I move on to our manifestation regarding an administrative matter that occurred. And again, trust is critical and trust is important. And again, trust begins with accountability. And we'd like to take this opportunity, Mr. Chair, if we could apologize because our team sent the wrong document to your team. And we'd like to beg the kind indulgence of the Committee on Energy and to our stakeholders if we could be given time to file a revised comment on the bill. So we would like to ask apology from we'd like to apologize for that. That was an administrative mishap on our part. And specifically, Mr. Chair, before I finish, we'd like to manifest that we would really be appreciative if the bill could contain that specific provision that was earlier discussed by Attorney Badisi, which we believe would be very useful in that it allows the DOE and the national government to evolve fast in managing this nascent industry, and that's the incorporation by doctrine clause, which would allow the national government, in essence, to adopt the standards that can be developed by the industry. That would be very, very useful. It's a very useful. We can already imagine how useful that tool would be, and something that we could really use in helping develop policy and in regulating the industry. So again, Mr. Chair, thank you for the opportunity to manifest our general comment. Regarding our specific comments, again, we apologize for the document that we sent. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Asek. And Asek, you know very well that this is not the first time that we've talked about this bill. We've been developing this bill for the last 2 years already, no? Shuffling papers back and forth. In fact, we've met with Attorney Bedisi on several occasions, physically and also online. Attorney Bedisi was here a few times to talk about this bill. And we were just surprised that we were furnished with a unofficial document. Personally, I thought that was the official document, official position paper of the Department of Energy. And I was quite surprised because even after talking about this for the last 2 years, and there was some confusion on what the DOE's position is. And I was hoping that we will get more detailed discussion today on the bill, no? Because the bill on hand right now is quite important to in terms of moving forward with this industry. And I would really like to discuss with the department on the several concepts in the bill, no? And the department being the implementer of this bill, your voice and opinion is very important because we don't want a bill that the department cannot execute. And we don't want a bill that the department has a lot of misgivings. So that's why I was quite surprised that we were furnished with an unofficial document. And now I understand that there is no position yet, no, on the bill, or there is a general position, but there's no detailed position on the concepts of the bill. Your apology is well taken, but I would like to get a definite answer and definite comment on the different concepts in the bill. We need to move forward together, legislative and executive, especially in this legislative process, because again, at the end, it will be the department who will be executing this bill. So we don't want finger pointing to happen after going through a very taxing legislative process. And you know that, no? The legislative process is not simple, no? It's very complicated and very taxing. So with that, I don't know, Asek, if you want to discuss the different concepts in the bill or reserve your comment later on. This will be the first hearing. We will have another hearing next week. But I would like to ask you if you are ready to answer on the different concepts that we included in the bill, because we will definitely take into account your comments and adjust certain provisions if you deem necessary to adjust. No? So are you ready to discuss those concepts right now?
Mr. Chair, if we could ask for the indulgence of the chair, if we could be given until Monday next week, Mr. Chair. The challenge really was how to put it all together with the other bureaus and the other services within the Department of Energy. There's still a bit of healthy internal discussion insofar as the specific provisions are concerned. So if we could be given, Mr. Chair, until Monday next week to submit our formal comments to the bill, or our specific comments to the bill. And again, Mr. Chair, we really apologize for the transmission of the wrong document that was sent to your office. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
With that, again, Asek, take note that we've been discussing and developing this bill for the last 2 years. So I would expect that the department will have a definite position on on the matter, and this is a work in progress. No, I acknowledge that this bill will evolve throughout the legislative process, and that's the nature of this work. But the voice of the Department of Energy and the ERC is so important that we will give it a lot of weight when it comes to the concepts that we will be discussing on hand. So yeah, we will await for your official position. Hopefully, it will be as detailed as possible. Our next hearing will be next Tuesday, and we would greatly appreciate it if you can furnish us your detailed position paper on Friday, so we have ample time to digest it and to analyze it, and by Tuesday we'll have enough time to discuss it. So with that, we'll move on to another important institution in this bill, which is the Energy Regulatory Commission, represented by Sirio, by Ms. Leila Sirio.
Hi, good morning, Chair. Actually, the Commission, through the leadership of our chairperson, Agnes de Benadera, supports the national policy and framework for the development of and regulation of the Philippine downstream industry, especially that it will ensure energy security through the promotion of nat gas as an additional environment-friendly energy source, as well as it will provide protection to the consumers by mandating competitive rates, fees, and charges. Actually, we have a few comments on the bill, and I hope you will also still allow us to submit our comments. But we observe that the powers and responsibilities provided in this bill are clear. There is a well delineation of duties between ERC and DOE. And there are some points that we just want to be clarified about. So if you will allow us to submit our comments within the week or on Monday, so that we will be able to look further into this provision, especially on the powers and responsibilities of the Energy Regulatory Commission.
Thank you, Ms. Laila. Thank you very much for your comments. But I hope that you've taken note that the responsibilities of the ERC here is quite important, no? Considering that some of the sectors, such as the transmission, the distribution, will be highly regulated, and we know for a fact that ERC will be new in this activity, and that's why we want to talk to ERC on a very detailed manner on the powers that will be lodged under ERC, and also the concepts that were embedded in the law. Are you ready to discuss that, or you want to defer that to again next Tuesday?
I think we have to defer for next Tuesday, sir.
Sige, Miss Leila. But next Tuesday will be the last hearing, hopefully. So we would like to hear your detailed comments, especially on the powers being delegated to ERC, on the industries that will be regulated by ERC, and the capacity building needed by the ERC. Also the budget, of course. Again, no, you're regulating electric power right now, but in the future you'll be regulating natural gas, specifically transmission and distribution. And we want to know exactly what are the requirements needed by ERC insofar as building capacity, insofar as developing its talent, and most of all, budget. So, and also, if the powers delineated between DOE and ERC are clear, no, because we know for a fact that there are in the electric power industry, there are sometimes confusion on who will be the institution promulgating circulars or promulgating rules for a specific topic. So we want to make sure that the lines are well delineated so that the actors and the players will be clear on who to talk to.
Okay, sorry.
Yes. Senator Risa, any comments to DOE and to ERC?
Well, Mr. Chairman, I actually had a few questions for each of these important, as the chairman said, very important agencies. So I'm a bit puzzled, Mr. Chairman, because as the chairman has said, the bill has been in development for a couple of years. And in fact, this hearing has been rescheduled twice. And certainly our DOE and ERC resource persons are fully aware of that. So I'm just a bit puzzled about this turn of events, Mr. Chair. But I will submit to the guidance of the chair. Should I pose my question to ERC now, or should I also just postpone it till Tuesday, Mr. Chairman?
I would suggest, Senator Risa, with your indulgence, to defer it until next Tuesday so that
Will do.
our two agencies will be more prepared. I'm equally puzzled as you.
Yes.
In fact, this is not a new bill. It took us 2 years, no? Because it's a new industry. Frankly speaking, I had to learn a lot also. So it took us 2 years to build this law. Looking at other jurisdiction, talking to experts, talking to our private proponents, and you're right. No, this was deferred for almost a month, and quite sadly, the two main actors in this bill are not ready to discuss in greater detail the concepts of the bill. No,
I'm really
so
hoping, Mr. Chair, that the private sector resource persons that the chair has invited on behalf of the committee, I'm expecting that they will be prepared. Baka mangyari dito sa development ng industry na ito, Mr. Chair, tulad nung sinalaysay ng ating mga international resource persons, that the private sector will go ahead and then government will have to adjust in terms of, as they said, no, in conversation with industry, crafting or refining and then fully implementing the legislation. Although, Mr. Chair, I do have one slightly not specifically related to the bill question for ERC on the VECO bill shock. May I ask just that question of them in this hearing, Mr. Chairman?
yes, go ahead. Since
Thank you,
ERC is
sir.
ready here.
Apo, salamat. Ms. Leila, could I just ask, ma'am, a complaint before the ERC was filed against the Visayan Electric Company for allegedly overpricing its customers. Apparently, our Cebuano sisters and brothers experienced the same bill shock, the term coined by the chairman, experienced the same bill shock as power consumers in Metro Manila. So just for my single question for the commission this morning, what is the status of this case? And also, could we be furnished, could the committee be furnished through the chair a copy of the complaint and other documents for our reference, Mr. Chairman?
Miss Leila, you may respond.
Good morning, Senator Risa.
Good morning, ma'am.
Good morning po. Actually, I am not so aware of that issue. So I think we can provide you information after this meeting.
Please do. Thank you, ma'am. Salamat po,
Yeah,
Mr. Chair.
po. Okay po.
Thank you. Thank you. Our next resource person or resource institution is the Philippine Competition Commission. Again, the PCC has a special responsibility in this bill, and the earlier on, the conversation around the TPA is a conversation on efficiency and competition. No, and if you look at the bill, the TPA occupies a very big space and discussion in the bill because we want to assure that from the onset there will be a vibrant and healthy competition among industry players. But in the absence of players, we have to make sure that competition is still vibrant. No, and it will redound to the benefit of our consumers. So let me call on the PCC represented by Attorney Faye Desagon.
Good morning, Mr. Chair, Senator Ontiveros. Happy New Year to everyone. Thank you again for inviting the PCC. Let me just open with the first came into awareness of the drafting of this measure earlier last year, sometime I think in mid-June. One of our commissioners actually pointed out that Senator Gatchalian is working on this measure, and we have been discussing it. Understandably, it is a new industry that we're looking into. So it is taking us a little bit more time understanding the kind of market that we should expect from this industry. So that said, we do have three main points that we will expound on further through a formal position paper that we hope to be able to submit within the week. So 3 points, two of which will discuss conceptual things that we discussed earlier with the foreign experts, and one on a jurisdictional matter. So first of all, Mr. Chair, is earlier it was emphasized that really the policy is focused on making sure that we deliver the supply to the consumers, and there was a lot of things said about fostering investment and taking care not to encourage having preferential contracts. So one of the things that we noted, particularly said by Professor Goldberg, was that the TPA should the kind of mechanism that TPA is establishing is supposed to promote competition. Based on how the bill is crafted so far, at least from our point of view, it may be counteracted. That whole concept of the TPA being promoting competition might actually be counteracted by how we treat by the proposed mechanism or classification of TPAs or of the transmission systems as a public utility. Mr. Chair, if I'd be allowed to remind the committee, the PCC has made its proposals, particularly through the Public Services Act amendments bill, that we find that transmission should not be one of those classified as gas transmission, at least, should not be one of those classified as a public utility covered by the PCE. We do recognize that gas distribution, electricity distribution, should be classified as public utilities because we recognize them as natural monopolies. So, given the ultimate and very urgent objective of ensuring that natural gas supply is available to our citizens, I think using a competition lens, unpacking all these concepts through a competition lens in the Philippine context, could be achieved through lowering the barriers to entry, meaning we may want to rethink requiring possibly the franchise requirement, the legislative franchise requirement for some of the industry players. And that, secondly, my second point as to the concepts is addressing these concerns on the vertical integration and possibly lessening the competition within this nascent industry. Is that we establish the FRAN terms, we built in the fair, reasonable, and non-discriminatory terms in the kinds of contracts that our industry players will be executing. We've identified some of the we've identified some of the provisions in the bill that we think it will benefit from putting the FRAN terms in. We can submit it to the committee later, budget section 4. Another one. I'm just looking through my list now.
Attorney
Mr.
Fake, can
Mr.
you
Chair.
Attorney Fake, can you rewind for about 1 minute? Attorney Fake, please rewind what you said about 2 minutes ago, because you got cut. Just rewind what you
Yes,
said two
yes,
minutes
Mr.
ago.
Chair. Yes, Mr. Chair. I apologize. Again,
Based on my notes, you mentioned about the three concepts: fair, reasonable, and non-discriminatory aspects. So from then on, you got cut.
Yes.
So can you repeat from then on?
Oh, yes, Mr. Chair. I was just outlining all the provisions that we've already identified that might benefit from having including the FRAN terms in the provision. So I can just list it down, send it to your staff, Mr. Chair, and we will also be formally submitting our position paper with the outline of all the provisions that we think should include the FRAN terms or all the transactions, all the kinds of transactions that should be executed between the industry players that should contain these fair, reasonable, and non-discriminatory provisions when they execute their contracts to prevent preferential treatment to those that are virtually integrated entities. So what's the other? Oh, and so lastly, our last point is on a jurisdictional aspect, I guess. So one of the things that we noted is under section 2. Oh my gosh, sorry. So I think section 12, it says here that it gives the PCC primary jurisdiction over any anti-competitive behavior of natural gas industry participants. Just to kind of align this with our already existing comprehensive competition law, we would recommend that the provision would state that the PCC shall exercise original and primary jurisdiction over any anti-competitive behavior of natural gas industry participants. Secondly, we also noted under the declaration of policy that we stated here on section 2, policy to protect consumers by mandating transparent and competitive rates. This may seem pedantic, but really, when we say competitive rates, this is really determined by market forces. So we recommend that this be changed from competitive to fair. Other than that, Mr. Chair, I think the committee might better appreciate the Commission's position through our position paper. And if there are any clarificatory questions or inputs from members of the committee, we would happily address them. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Thank you, Attorney Fee. Senator Antiveros, any questions to PCC?
Not right now, Mr. Chair, but I'll continue listening to our other resource persons as well, and may come back to PCC if a question should come up across the different agencies. Thank you, Attorney Fee. Salamat, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Thank you, Senator Antiveros. Attorney Fee, you made a very interesting comment that the transmission system will not need a legislative franchise because in PCC's view, it's not considered a public utility. No, but historically, no, transmission systems such as pipelines are given a legislative franchise. The one by First Gen, no? Because the pipeline that First Gen owns, First Gas in particular, has a legislative franchise. No, so can you expound further on this comment, and what is the legal basis for PCC to consider pipelines and transmission systems are not public utilities? No?
Well, we'd like to go back, Mr. Chair, to our position with the list of public utilities, are recommended public utilities under the Public Services Act, or those that should technically be required to get a franchise or have how do you say it, some ownership limitations, Mr. Chair. So we did explore in other jurisdictions. There was a list of what are considered as natural monopolies, and these would include a natural gas distribution, meaning the last mile, the one that basically the consumers would benefit from. Now, we go back to our definition of what is a public utility. Based on jurisprudence, we look at JG, Summit Holdings, etc. And we find here that there are for example, there's a difference, I think, on how we treat the own use transmission system and the own use transmission system and the RTPA transmission system, for example. So we find that the proposed provision actually expands the definition of what currently constitutes a public utility, which is counterintuitive to the moves to rationalize the coverage of the Public Services Act. So in our position paper, then we propose to limit the coverage of public utility to sectors such as electricity distribution, electricity transmission, gas or petroleum pipeline distribution, water pipeline distribution, and sewerage pipeline distribution system. So it's I think we based our study or our recommendation then back in the 17th Congress, and we stand by that recommendation now based on studies conducted by the OECD and the World Bank. We can provide you with our I think distribution pipelines are basically the final step in delivering natural gas to last mile consumer, to the individual homes. While the transmission systems are really, at least from our understanding, how this bill is treating it, is designed as a grid or trunk line system involving the movement of large volumes of natural gas to the middle mile user. So our take really, Mr. Chair, is not while it may have some public use element. It is not really primarily between the public and the transmission player. So unless the natural gas transmission system is actually shown to meet all the public utility criteria based on established criteria laid out by the Supreme Court or under the Constitution, then it should not be classified as a public utility like a gas distribution system, and may not actually be subject to foreign ownership limitations as well. So again, Mr. Chair, we would be happy to expound on this more in our position paper. There are a bit more of nuances that we discuss on with regards to why we find that possibly parts of the transmission system might not actually be classified as a public utility that may require a franchise. We understand the need for permitting, definitely. It may be a regulatory job, but we would like to explore this concept further, and possibly ease the entry of players into the market.
Thank you, Attorney Fay. But earlier you mentioned that the PCC considered electricity or electric transmission lines as public utility. Is that correct? Did I hear you correct earlier?
That's correct, Mr. Chair. It's one of our recommended industries to be included under the Public Services Act as part of a public utility, as public utility. That's correct, Mr. Chair.
Okay. No, because this is a very important comment, and please substantiate it with your legal basis, because my appreciation of public utilities have a monopolistic tendency, no,
Yes.
and therefore you have to regulate it because it's only one, no, and these industries, because of its monopolistic tendencies, the public has no choice but to use it.
Yes.
Therefore, government needs to step in and to regulate both pricing and services.
Yes.
In this bill, the LNG transmission line will be somewhat or probably almost the same as the electric transmission line, in a sense that it will only be one of its kind, no? Because having multiple natural gas pipelines will be quite costly for the public because you cannot achieve economies of scale. The reason for this monopolistic tendencies is basically to achieve economies of scale. The bigger you are, the cheaper it is for our consumers. But if you have, let's say, multiple transmission lines, it's not only very difficult to construct because it's a pipeline, but it's also very costly for our consumers because it's not designed that way. You know, for example, just think of right of way. If you have multiple right of ways, that is quite costly. But if you have only one right of way carrying the same product, then it's you reach or you achieve economies of scale. So, but I would like to give it the benefit of the doubt, no, because admittedly, getting a franchise is very difficult. No, it's not that easy. It's the same legislative process that we are doing now, and we all know that it's a very difficult process. So, but then again, we cannot do away with the requirements of the Constitution that if you're a public utility, you need a franchise. So, but I want to give that the benefit of the doubt because hearing our international resource persons earlier, especially Professor Silke, uh, the the requirement for a franchise is quite difficult, and it becomes a barrier to entry. No, so
That's right,
please furnish us with your legal basis on that.
Mr. Chair.
I would like to read that and analyze that, and
Yes, Mr.
please cite also your basis on that declaration that LNG transmission lines should not be declared as public utilities.
Uh, Mr. Chair, if I may be allowed to just clarify, it's not the so we actually listed down. I'm going back again to our position on what should be included in the Public Services Act as public utilities. We I am basing my statement on that list, and it is quite an exclusive list, but not without any leeway to further. I mean, depending on the determination of the National Economic Development Authority, etc., legislature, of course. It's just that based on international studies, again, studies that we've relied upon since the 17th Congress, it is only the sorry, um, it is only the gas pipeline distribution system and not gas transmission system that should be considered as part of the public utilities that should be regulated under the Public Services Act, which would then require a franchise and would be subjected to some ownership limitations. But again, Mr. Chair, we will provide you with our position paper with the detailed resources that we relied upon. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you.
Mr.
Thank you,
Chairman.
Attorney Faye. Yes, Senator Risa.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Before the chair continues, I'd just like to make of record that Attorney Faye's comments are really very important to us, not just considering in another committee the pending public services bill as well, but also thinking about it in relation to the bill we are discussing here. Of course, we all know that considering several bills parallel is because we're trying to put up a coherent policy framework affecting both energy and all other aspects of national development. But I'm hoping and I'm confident that the chair will pursue our consideration of this bill on the development of the midstream gas industry, including how it relates to, well, of course, our national interests and even current constitutional principles like the 60-40 requirement that Attorney Faye also mentioned. So, hindi naman ito usapin ng unahan kung aling bill yung unang matapos at maging batas, but I'm really glad of the opportunity we have, Mr. Chair, in this committee and with our resource persons who are of such great help to us to have this space, this time to articulate these principles, to debate about them, and to try to come up with the best possible versions of the law, including as they relate to questions like the commons and privatization and how these two spheres should relate to each other, particularly to us Filipinos at this stage of our development. So thank you, Mr. Chair. At salamat din kay Attorney Faye.
Thank you, Senator Ontiveros. We'll await the position paper of PCC, but they're absolutely correct, no? Because that legal basis will have implications on other transmission assets in our country. No, we have water transmission, we have electricity transmission, and now natural gas transmission. No, admittedly, this is a new industry. We don't have such industry yet, although there is a precedent. First Gas owns a pipeline that has a legislative franchise. No, basically it's a transmission pipeline. No, we don't have a distribution pipeline here, not like in the States, but in the future we might have that. No, so with that, we call on Admiral Lista for his comments. PNOC.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, Senator Hontiveros. And we would like to thank the chairman and the members of the committee for inviting us. This is our first time to join this endeavor, and we would like to express some comments. We made a position paper, Mr. Chairman. We will submit it to you after we finish its attachments because we just finished it yesterday. But may I just make a few comments that which I personally feel that maybe we are talking to the wrong consultants, to the wrong people from USA and EU. Have we invited our neighbors from ASEAN and ASCO? Because we are more related to them than USA and EU. USA produces oil and gas, and it is a neighbor to the one of the biggest producers of gas. EU is the same. They are neighbors to oil and gas producing countries. ASEAN, when we came up with the Philippines, Mr. Chairman, was one of the first who established their own Philippine National Oil Company, second only to Indonesia. And I do not know what happened, but we did not pursue the efforts of developing our oil fields. And so we were left behind. The other countries, Asian neighbors, are successful because they permitted their national oil companies to grow and even develop their own energy direction. Their countries and their people today are benefiting from these steps. ASEAN permitted the national oil companies to help the growth of their energy industry. After we sold Petron, Mr. Chairman, it did not engage in drilling, but concentrated on other business proposals that makes more money for them. After PNOC sold EDC, EDC stopped developing our geothermal projects, except those that could bring profits. It was different with our Asian neighbors. Even today, Mr. Chairman, Singapore, who does not have any gas or oil at all, trades gas to provide 97% of their gas power plants because 97% of their plants, Mr. Chairman, are powered by gas. Listening from the previous comments from our consultants, we may be looking at the wrong models. We may be required to come out with more laws. In ASEAN, the oil and gas industries flourished not mainly because of the participation of the private sector, but because of the strong and active role of their national oil companies. Indonesia, represented by Pertamina, Malaysia, represented by Petronas, and Thailand, represented by PTT, paved the way in the development of their oil and gas sector. Today, Mr. Chairman, Vietnam and others are not far behind. The Philippines, unfortunately, which was established way ahead of them, is now lagging behind because PNOC was emasculated by too many rules and regulations combined with the privatization of its earning assets, while other NOCs are amassing assets. In our experience also, Mr. Chairman, in the Philippine energy business, it is a dream to have full disclosure. I do not know where trust begins. But in my experience in the past years that I've been dealing with DOE has been issued TRO several times when it asked for the unbundling of several items and costs. And Transco cannot even inspect NGCP. And even PFC, Mr. Chairman, is not sure whether we are getting the right data from Malampaya. As I said, Mr. Chairman, we are in support in your effort to come up with this regulation. But we are submitting a full report and where we should start, because it should not be only concentrated on midstream. It should it should be a total bill that we should address from drilling, midstream to downstream. We are lagging behind because we are looking at, as I said, probably the wrong models. May I recommend, Mr. Chairman, that we invite also good good resource speakers from our neighbors who can just be here anytime. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Admiral Lista. And for the record, those people we invited are resource persons. They're not the committee's consultant. We came across CLDP, or the Commercial Law Development Program of the United States Department of Commerce, because it's one of their programs to help develop natural gas industries in developing nations. And because of our impending depletion of Malampaya, um, they volunteered, or it's part of the U.S. government's um, goodwill program to help us with their international experience when it comes to developing natural gas markets. In fact, in fairness to them, Admiral, they submitted to us not only the U.S. experience but also international experience. Actually concentrating on the Southeast Asian market. So we've been discussing with them different markets, different jurisdictions, because their group covers the entire world, no? Especially developing nations. But we greatly appreciate if you can refer to us other resource persons from developing nations. Like I said earlier, and we've also heard from them, that different countries will have different situations, and the nuances is very critical in terms of developing our law. So I would like to tap into your network in terms of resource persons and people who can help us in sharpening this law. As to your comment on developing our own indigenous source, I fully agree with you. In fact, PNOCs should be directed and empowered to develop more oil and gas potential in our country. I fully agree with you that we were left behind in the last 20 years. We only have one source, Malampaya, no? But we all know that the West Philippine Sea is abundant with oil and gas, and it's blessed with resources that we can use for our own people. Unfortunately, you're absolutely correct. It's not being tapped. So moving forward, maybe in a different forum, we will talk to you about how to empower PNOC to jumpstart our own indigenous oil and gas potential. Naiwanan talaga tayo. If you look at other countries in Indonesia, in Thailand, all of their national oil companies were tasked and empowered to explore and harness the full potential of the resources. But that's on a different discussion. So with that, Senator Risa, any questions to PNOC?
Well, Mr. Chairman, this was actually a question I was originally going to ask the DOE, but since it also pertains to oil, I wonder if President Lista would care to comment on a question about the status of production at the reported Alegria oil field in Cebu, since the President Lista was lamenting about how we have not developed our domestic oil industry. Well, a few years back, government also announced that the Alegria oil field in Cebu was rich in oil and gas, and that this would generate numerous job opportunities and income for Filipinos. Would the good President Lista know, Mr. Chairman, what the status of production is at Alegria, if any, Mr. Chairman? President Lista, nakamute po kayo.
You may respond, Admiral Lista.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Ma'am. I think ASEC Pulido or President Ross can answer that properly
Yes.
because they have the data, Ma'am.
Thank you, sir.
Sec
So,
Pulido, you may respond.
Hi, Senator Risa. Ma'am, regarding your query about the Alegre oil field, it's currently ramping up. They've had experienced a few delays. They're supposed to be submitting a first quarter this year about their production capacity. But then again, ma'am, their production capacity is not, although it is significant from a local perspective, it's not enough to supply at a regional or even more so at a national level.
mhm.
We can submit the data to your office, Senator, for the specifics of their production for the past year.
Yes, please, ASIC Pulido. I would appreciate that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And in the next hearing, I'll pursue this question also based on what the DOE will be submitting to the committee in relation to the topic of the exploration for new domestic sources of natural gas. Given that Malampaya is expected to significantly decline starting 2024. But aside from Alegria, we are also, and this was discussed in the budget briefing of DOE, where it was told the Senate, that it appears that off North West Palawan, there is the Recto Bank. And then there's also Benam Rice, which has been spoken of by UP Institute of Maritime Affairs and Law of the Sea Director J. Batong Bakal as containing untapped natural gas and heavy metal. So then there's also the presupposition in the bill that we'll be importing a large amount of natural gas. So yes, Mr. Chair, in next week's hearing, I'll just follow up with the DOE through ASIC Pulido, not just the one possible source in Alegria, but several that if cobbled together, maybe can indicate existing or persisting potentials, not just for our oil industry, but also the midstream gas industry contemplated by this bill. Salamat, ASEC. Salamat, Chair.
Thank you, Senator Risa. And we have a few more resource persons to um, to call on. However, because of time constraint, we will suspend the hearing today. And to also give way, especially to the Department of Energy and to ERC, and to listen to their position paper. Again, to ERC and to DOE, I am imploring on you to take a look at this bill seriously and come up with a very detailed comment and position on the various concepts in the bill. If you look at the bill, there's a whole section dedicated to ERC and to DOE because of their importance in promoting, developing, and regulating this industry. So again, I would like to strongly remind our colleagues in the DOE and ERC to take a look at this bill seriously, to come up with a detailed position paper and be ready to discuss it in the next hearing. The next hearing will be on January 12, Tuesday, 9 a.m. next week. So with that, before we suspend this hearing, any last words from Senator Risa?
No more, Mr. Chair. Maraming salamat at maraming salamat din po sa lahat ng ating resource persons. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Senator Risa. And with that, I thank you and apologize to our resource persons that we didn't have enough time to complete everyone or to call on everyone. But rest assured, next week we will continue this hearing, and we will be more than happy to again receive you and to hear your comments. And please feel free to send us your position paper even prior to the hearing next week. With that, thank you very much for your time. Thank you very much for your participation. And we will see you on January 12 for the continuation of this hearing. Thank you very much. Meeting is suspended.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.